Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently had the pleasure of talking with Mr. John C. Wright on the subject of what you might loosely call morality in fiction, but in particular about fiction which is trying to sell an immoral idea to convince people that it's moral. And it was a very broad-ranging conversation on a variety of subjects kind of related to that. And I probably take a slightly more negative practical view than he does. So it was a very interesting conversation comparing things. Now, I'd like to give you a little background on Mr. Wright. So I'm going to read from his official biography on his website, which you can find at sci-fi-wright.com. John C. Wright is a retired attorney, newspaperman, and newspaper editor who was only once on the lam and forced to hide from the police who did not admire his newspaper. In 1984, he graduated from St. John's College in Annapolis, home of the Great Books program. If you haven't heard it, everyone goes through, reads the same great books, the most important books written over the last, I'll just say 3,000 years. That's slightly too far. And it's a fascinating approach to university education. Produces some very well-educated people. Anyway. Graduated from the College of William and Mary's Law School and was admitted to the practice of law in 3 jurisdictions, New York, Maryland, and D.C. But his law practice was unsuccessful enough to drive him into bankruptcy soon after. His stint as a newspaperman for the St. Mary's Today was more rewarding spiritually, but alas, also a failure financially. He presently works successfully as a writer in Virginia, where he lives in fairy tale-like happiness with his wife, the authoress L. Jaggy Lamplighter, and their 4 children, Ping Ping, Orville, Wilbur, and Just Right. He has published short fiction in Asimov's science fiction, in F and SF, or should I say is fantasy and science fiction. I don't know how to read that out loud. In Absolute Magnitude and elsewhere. His novel Orphans of Chaos was a finalist for the Nebula Award in 2005. His novel Somewhither won the inaugural Dragon Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 2016. In 2015, he made history by being nominated for 6 Hugo Awards in 1 year, more than any other author. And his list of publications is as you can see, it's long. His list of publications is long. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation. I found it very interesting. Mr. Wright is an extremely interesting person to talk to, and I hope you enjoy. So I was recently reading your blog post on how Heinlein had fooled you for 40 years. I think it was a repost, but it's a very interesting post about Heinlein's portrayal of a bit of what you might loosely call sexual morality, and how he had carried it off as being something very natural, but that upon mature reflection, he realized was actually rather wrong. So it brings up a broad topic, too, about fiction and the morality of authors, which I want to talk about. But first, would you mind summarizing the blog post in question?
Not a bit. Robert Heinlein is one of my favorite science fiction authors, but I liked him more when I was a kid because as a grown-up, his philosophy that he puts across in his books, and he puts it across fairly consistently, is one that I think is false to facts, and one that I think is not a useful philosophy to try to operate by. Basically, he was a child of the 1960s, and he was trying to promote the sexual revolution. And I say this because you have to be very careful, because writers are tricky creatures, and we don't necessarily put ourselves in stories when people think we are. But if you see the same themes over and over again in a writer's work, and if the story point being made has no other plot point, if the scene could be erased, ejected with no change to anything that comes before or comes since, then you know it's merely there because the author wanted to pause in his storytelling and stand on a soapbox and make a speech. And I have to say, in all fairness, I'm not the only one who says that Robert Heinlein does this, but I also have to say that he knows how to make a very entertaining soapbox speech. But the problem is that as a young, naive reader, I did not realize exactly what was being was being told me. Now, in this particular scene, Oscar Gordon, our hero, finds an ad in a want ad in the paper while he is between jobs. And the want ad is, "Are you a coward? Do you want to be a hero? If so, come to such and such address for to sign up." And he comes across this ad 2 or 3 times, and so he says, "I'm out of money. I might as well go and see if this is on the level. See if it's serious. I mean, who puts in a want ad for a hero these days?" So he goes in there, and sure enough, he meets the most beautiful girl in the world, the sexy Space Empress Star, her wisdom 57, who is actually the queen of the 20 universes, and she needs a hero to walk the glory road with a sword and to go commit a mission and get the MacGuffin known as the egg of the Phoenix egg, and he's going to live happily ever after. And Heinlein wrote a rather, he was writing in the style of I can't think of his name now, the guy who wrote the Puck Tisney books, James Bratch Cabell, where he was writing kind of cynical tongue-in-cheek because, of course, the happy ending for our hero doesn't turn out to be that happy. He gets bored with nothing to kill and nothing to do, with just riches and fame being showered on him. So at the surprise ending of the book, which I don't mind spoiling the ending, he decides to go out again on the glory road and to once again put his life on the line. Now, there's a scene in the middle where he is being offered the hospitality of the house in a primitive world where the people are very generous. And not one, but 3 young ladies come by. They're not given names as far as I remember, into his bedroom while he's getting ready to go to bed, and they want to copulate with him like mad weasels. And he, because of his Kansas upbringing, finds that a little untoward and won't do it. The mother comes by and seems upset, and she's willing to sleep with him or anyone else in the house, and he says, no, that's not going to work. So, and then the next day they leave. And so he idly tells the story to Star as they're both horse riding away, or is it walking? I forget which. And she is outraged and says, "You have violated their customs. We have to go back there and make amends and make apologies and have a small orgy because their customs require that heroes copulate with beach bunnies. And you are a barbarian if you do not abide by the customs of the land you're going through." And so he goes back after his girlfriend, who he later marries, persuades him that he's got to sleep with harlots for the sake of courtesy. Now, looking at that little plot point with grown-up eyes, I just go, now wait a minute. Is Mr. Heinlein actually seriously telling me that the Space Empress here, who is young and beautiful, that she not only has no jealousy in her heart for her man, that she actually wants him, orders him, she browbeats him into going and sleeping with the girl? Are you telling me, A, that girls like men that they can browbeat? Because I have not found that to be the case. The henpecked husband is almost a trophy, is a stereotype. And B, that they want you to sleep with other women. Okay, usually the cultures that have polygamy, it's usually polygamy, not polyandry. It's usually one guy and several women who aren't given much of a choice. Like a Turk with a harem where the women are brought in by force, and they're not Christian, so they don't actually ask you for permission to marry. The idea of asking for permission to marry is a Western invention. It's a European invention. So Heinlein is asking me to believe that this is normal for human psychology, for her to come and order this guy to go back in, and you have to obey the customs of any landscape you're walking through, because that is the highest good. That's the highest law, is when in Rome, do as the Romans. But then when I reread the story not long ago, it struck me as being so phony, I couldn't believe it. Here's why. Because the author gets to pick what landscape you're walking through. And he wasn't walking through the Puritan Massachusetts world where if the guy was found drinking a beer on Sunday, he had to go in for a public whipping. Okay? Well, you mean you drank a beer on Sunday? Go back immediately and take your licks because you must obey the rules of the... I see. Okay. So, but sleeping with a young, attractive girl with nicely curved, that you can break that. You can break your rules and abide by their rules. So I'm thinking, what man... I understand how many teenagers and underdeveloped men would be lured by this and think it's the greatest planet ever to visit is the planet of free women, the planet of willing stewardesses, as we say. But I just keep thinking, wait a minute, as a father, I happen to know that I have a duty to my children to raise them. So if I sleep with someone who is going to raise them in their culture, then my son or daughter is going to be raised so that she's going to be told to sleep with wandering heroes? And have I fulfilled my duty as a father if I simply throw my seed into the random world here? And I noticed that he also didn't pick the culture where you have to sleep with the mummy of the grandma and commit necrophilia in order to show respect to the ancestor gods. And you didn't have to sleep with the family dog to show your love of nature. And you didn't have to sleep with, you didn't have to bend over and take it from the guy of the house like a good sodomite, like they do in Sodom. Uh, so it's only you only get to break the rules that you really want to break anyway, like drinking on Sunday and sleeping around. So whatever, but whatever. He wouldn't apply. I knew Heinlein well enough to know. I've read all his books. I've read most of his nonfiction, and he never proposes that you should. He says you should take off your hat, take off your shoes if you go into a mosque, be polite to other cultures, but he doesn't say you should abide by their rules for anything other than when their rules disagree with our rules that he doesn't like. See? Because if the rule had been, welcome to our Aztec planet, we're about to rip open the beating hearts of our slaves on the chalk mule to feed the sun, please join us in the ceremony, do you think a real hero would say, yeah, great idea? I mean, after all, in their world, the sun might actually go out if you don't commit the human sacrifices. So who am I to judge? I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it for a second. But I felt angry. I felt angry at Heinlein because I had believed that whole sexual revolution bull hockey for most of my adult life, and I believed, like he was trying to preach that marriage was a artificial contrivance, a convenience. Okay, not that it was one of the most important things in human civilization, not that it was crucial for the raising of the young, not that it was all important for both your psychology and happiness and that of your wife and that of your kids. He was trying to preach what nowadays has become basically the law of the land, which is marriage is whatever you feel like saying it is. If you want to say it's 5 people, fine. For you, it's 5 people. If you want to say it's 2 guys, fine. If you want to say it's 2 guys, a dog, and the ghost of grandma, go for it. That is the modern attitude. Okay, and you find it everywhere. And more to the point, you find the attitude that anyone who thinks like I do, that you should base these things on logic and reason, that you should base these things on the way real human beings actually act, and the way real reality actually is, that I'm the bad guy, I'm the bigot, I'm the closed-minded, parochial, ninny. Well, I'm sorry, you're from the '60s. No other decade in the entire history of Earth agrees with you. Not even Sodom and Gomorrah, not even Rome at its worst. So you guys are actually the guys who are parochial. You can't see outside your little bubble of self-satisfied little smug theory, and the theory doesn't fit the facts. So I was actually angry at this guy because he had me hook, line, and sinker. I was completely fooled. I was an idiot. So,
and that's actually precisely that is a very interesting segue into that subject of the author who is trying to sell vice, because an author is in a very unique position within fiction of being able to construct an entire world that within itself works for whatever he's trying to sell. The free love of the 1960s, to the degree that anyone ever seriously tried to put it into practice, all accounts are that it was a really abject failure pretty quickly.
Of course.
That some people with enough drugs managed to last 2 or 3 years in that sort of lifestyle.
And it's not new. If you remember the days of Shelley and Byron, the poets in those days were trying to sell the same story. It's just that the Victorians are a little more awake. But you notice that the Victorians were the enemies of people like Shelley and Byron, and so the guys from the '60s picked that up as their bad guy. Heinlein's bad guy is always a stuffy old maiden aunt who acts like a Victorian when there were no Victorians in the 1960s. So he's picking up an old idea that he's rehashing. And I should say, everyone from the '60s, the free love idea was just the rehash of the idea from the Romantic era, which the Victorians were actually trying to put a stop to the excesses of the period before them, where there was a lot of free love, and consequently they had a lot of bastardy. And the reason why bastards are called bastards is not because we don't like them. It's because if they're raised without a father, they tend to be, by and large, a little less trustworthy and a little more selfish. because they don't have a guy looking out for them. And they don't have anyone to teach them how violence is supposed to be used and controlled. That's one thing a father has to do for his little boys, is tell them where the limits are. See, I'm not saying women can't do it, but I'm saying they don't do it naturally and easily. They have to try a little harder. And if you're already the only support for your family, then that may be too much for anyone to do, male or female.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of I mean, it's an entire subject
To your
into
point,
itself.
it's not a new idea. It's as old
Yeah.
as sin. It is in fact sin.
Yes, but whereas free love in the 1960s could be made to work for like the length of a music concert weekend, and sometimes a bit longer than that if the drugs are.
Odd that you picked that as the example. Yes, yes.
But it works. I mean, you utterly trash the farm, and there are all sorts of unsustainable things that can be made to work for short periods of time, as long as you don't have to deal
I
with the
guess
aftermath.
your definition of work. If you're the kind of guy who can sleep with a woman and feel no emotion toward her, I suggest there's something wrong with your psychology.
Well, in fairness to the people, I think they were using an awful lot of drugs, at least by reputation.
If you're the kind of guy who has mangled your thinking apparatus with drugs, I think there's something wrong with your thinking apparatus.
Well, yes, there absolutely is.
Okay, so it's not a true to facts theory then. It just doesn't fit reality as we know it. If you have to alter reality with reality altering drugs in order to get it to fit, in order to stop thinking about the consequences, even to yourself, even if there's no kids involved, even to yourself, you share your body with someone else, and you share your mind, you share your soul, whether you want to or not. That's just part of reality. And to break away from that is something like a amputation. At least it's something like pulling off tape. Now, from what I understand, of the female half of the species, guys can do it a little more easily than women can, but it still hurts on both sides. And turning into the kind of guy who can do that without a qualm of conscience, that's not necessarily a good thing either. I understand that if you're a mafia hitman, you have to learn to be able to kill without a qualm of conscience, but that's not necessarily good for you. Not good for you in the long run. You can say it works because the mafia pays well, but still, it's not even without the law and order attitude. Okay, even if you're talking about your personal happiness in life, I don't think people who get dead inside get to be happy. See?
No, I don't think they do, but it tends to break. I meant works only in contrast to breaks down in the sense of everybody has a falling out, and everybody who had been associated at the time of the free love ceased to be associated afterwards. That during that period in which they're at least continuing to associate with each other, it is working according to the model they themselves are trying to accomplish. And then when everybody starts hating each other and everybody goes their separate ways, it has ceased to work, even according to the model that the people trying to put it into practice had hoped would work.
If you're the Shah of Turkey, then you can make it work because you have the force of law on your side to punish any women who disobey you. I guess then it would work.
Yeah, well, and there's an asterisk.
And they have a pecking order. The women have a pecking order in their harem.
Exactly. Actually,
if you're doing it all voluntarily, it kind of runs against human nature. Now, human nature is pliable to a degree, but here's the difference: it's pliable to a degree. It's not pliable infinitely. Everything in the '60s was based on the idea that human nature is infinitely pliable, a blank slate, an infinite piece of rubber that you can stretch as far as you like. Experience of real life shows that it only stretches so far, and then it snaps back and hits you in an uncomfortable position.
It does.
And
No,
the reason why everyone in the '60s has to studiously avoid looking at anything in history, and studying what the ancients who came before us say, is because otherwise it's too obvious that you can only stretch this piece of rubber so far before it snaps back. See?
exactly.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, exactly. And it's interesting. Just by way of contrast, to show how far human nature can be stretched. The polygamy I'm more familiar with is African polygamy, because I was actually knew a man when I was in grad school studying math, who is the son of an African chief, and he was one of three from his mother. His father had something like 12 wives, I think. But the thing is, this was essentially a village where there was a very large compound, and each wife had her own house.
Mhm.
And so and each wife had rights in the husband, such that he would, he would stay in each house one night in a rotation.
Sure.
And so each wife had this thing that she was owed, where the chief didn't actually have an option. So, just to show even in this very different circumstance from for monogamy, there's still rules that were in there that heavily constrained what the chief could
Sure.
do.
And I assure you, the chief's wife did not sleep around with wandering heroes like Oscar Gordon.
No, no,
No.
they didn't.
In fact,
And
it's you bring up an interesting point because most societies outside of Europe, most societies outside of Christendom, are polygamous. Polygamy is one of the things you have to give up if you become a Christian, and they do work, but they don't work to make women that happy. I mean, if you got a high death rate and there's not enough men to go around, maybe half life is better than none. But there's still going to be an automatic rivalry between your kids and the kids of the other wife. There's going to be an automatic kind of pecking order between the first wife and the third wife, and so on and so forth. There's going to be tensions that Christians don't have to worry about, and
oh
there's also
yeah,
going to be divorce, which is also not good for women.
mm-hmm.
Perhaps in a modern technological society, divorce can be painted as being freeing to women, but in the old days, when you were living close to the soil and you were living hand to mouth, and you had to farm the land or you had to hunt to get fed, divorce was not happy even among aristocratic Roman women. Divorce
Mm-hmm.
was not a good deal for them. It was for the men. The men ran things, and that was the rule they wanted. In other words, and they did it to benefit themselves. They didn't do it to benefit the common good, the whole society.
Yeah, and it's so that I think paints a reasonable picture without going too far into it about the many constraints that are placed in this thing and how it looks very, very different from the free love ideal of the 60s.
Oh yeah,
And so and the reason I brought up especially like the 60s and the drugs and so on, because drugs were very helpful in maintaining these sort of fictions for more than a few days, to stretch the fictions into months or even occasionally a few years. By contrast, an author who is writing a story can make the characters do whatever he wants. He can
yeah,
make the characters happy with these completely unnatural things. And oh, please, no, no, you have to go back and cheat on me.
yeah. Because then you have to aim the book kind of at a younger audience, because an older audience is going to think your character is now acting stiff and lifeless. And that's true for any character that you use to try to make a point. If you use him as a sock puppet merely to say what you would want to say, then the character kind of dies. He doesn't have his own life to him. He doesn't have his own spirit to him. Uh, I myself would be. I have great respect for my characters. Whenever they come to life, I of course shout like Dr. Victor von Frankenstein, and I let them do what they would naturally do, and I let their own logic play out the way they play out, and they don't have to agree with me. Certainly, my villains don't agree with me. So once again, I have to warn all your listeners that just because a character says or does certain things, or just because you put a certain thing in a story, does not mean the author himself believes it. Now, in cases like Robert Heinlein, or I will say Ayn Rand, who's a writer that I like and respect, they believe their own snake oil. They believe their own doctrine that they're trying to spread. Uh, and they even may or may not try to live that way themselves. How happy they end up being, I mean, that's hard to judge from the outside. From what I hear, though, you know, but be that as it may, that's not the point. You can't, especially can't judge an author who's dead based on whether or not he lived up to what he was preaching and whether or not it did good for him. Um, the
There's
question though
another.
is to be there's actually kind of more than one question. The question here is how can you tell when it's preaching as opposed to storytelling? Because back when I was an atheist, I wrote a story that had an extremely Christian flavor and ending to it, but I did not believe a word of what I was saying. I was writing down something the character who had come to life in my imagination had to say in order for the story to make sense at the end. And I don't think anyone could have told what my belief was based on reading that story. So Heinlein was a bit of a uh, provocateur, a raconteur, or some other French word that ends with tour. He tried to throw out ideas to throw us, a screwball at you to see if you would take a swing, to see what the imagination would he could provoke in you if you had to sit here and think about how your society is put together and think about what the alternatives were, which I actually think is a useful thing to think if that's what you're really doing. If you're trying to think about how society could be different and you got your own blueprint that you're trying to persuade someone of, uh, and you're not telling him that's what you're doing, and you're trying to fool someone into believing your opinion with strawman arguments or with a bogus example that you yourself set up to actually go your way, you know, sorry, but Oscar Gordon and Starr should have ended up hating each other and sleeping around, cheating on each other, and not getting along, and they kind of end up that way. So
Mhm. Well, that actually brings up, I think, a very interesting thing with regard to how to tell an author's message. And it doesn't even have to be a message in the sense that they should have used Western Union. It could also be just a something the author takes to be true but is false and gets woven in. In particular, whether the mere presence of vice is neither good nor bad. It's simply a thing. The question, I think, that really comes up about the presentation of vice is, does it work out well or does it work out badly? And not obviously in a simplistically beating somebody over the head sense of it working out well or badly, but does it work out well in contradiction to the internal logic of the viciousness, or does it work out badly in consonance with the internal logic of the
allow
viciousness?
me to throw your question back on you, if I may, with two examples. And forgive me if these examples are a little wordy, but I think the point is an important one. I saw two movies. One of them was called um, I can't think of the name. One was called Dirty Harry and Crazy Larry. It was about a group of bank robbers, and they were successful bank robbers. And at the end of the movie, they get away successfully, and they're in the car with bags of money, laughing and whooping it up. And the very last scene in the very last second of film is them ignoring a stoplight, running across a railroad track, getting hit by a train, and all killed instantly. And I was not there when the director decided to make that last scene, but I thought someone must have said to him, the producers want them not to get away with crime. They don't want you to glorify crime, so these guys have to not get away with it. So bang, a train out of nowhere kills them, and the car explodes because all movie cars carry explosives and nitroglycerin on board, so they go up in huge fireballs, burning all the money. So that was one story, was not integral to the plot, even though it was a moral I agree with because I believe crime doesn't pay. But it made for a bad storytelling ending. On the other
Was this a
hand,
comedy, by the way?
it was not a comedy. It was a heist film,
Okay.
and there was a another film that was rather famous called Dangerous Liaisons, starring I believe Glenn Close, where, and I thought this was one of the subtlest things I'd ever seen. At the beginning of the film, a lady in aristocratic France in the last century tries to get a gentleman to seduce another lady and to have an affair with her, and she's doing it in order to kind of ruin their standing in society because she wants to create a scandal. And the way the filmmaker presented the action is you're kind of rooting for the guy because it's like a heist film. You want to see how, if he can use his wits to figure out how to seduce the innocent girl. But halfway through the film, very subtly, the tone changes. The guy starts realizing he's done something horrible. He feels bad about himself. The girl he seduced actually falls in love with him, and her marriage is now on the rocks. And the guy blames the woman who put him up to this. The public finds out, and she gets booed and hissed out of polite society, and she fails. She falls down like Lucifer from heaven, like lightning. And the reason why I said it was so subtle is the filmmaker used all the tricks of lighting and background music and approach to make the thing look like an innocent little jaunt into the sexual escapades. And then at the end, you found out that there were real people involved who had realistic reactions that are, and of course, the sex drive is one of the deepest, strongest drives in the human psyche. Uh, and of course, the reaction was a powder keg of unhappiness at the end. See, everyone's life was ruined of the three main characters. And I thought that was really subtle because usually an author who goes out of his way to make something look good, to glamorize something, he actually means it to stay glamorous the whole time. You don't usually go into a superhero film where beating up the bad guys is glamorized and then suddenly have, the guy break someone's neck at the end. That would be a terrible film. No one would ever make such a horrible superhero film as that, because superheroes are supposed to glamorize the violence. They're supposed to show a white knight on a white horse coming and killing the dragon. That's what the point of it is. Now, if you start with a film noir film and the evil and the people are crooked, you once again you can't have it end on the wrong note. You can't have it end with The guy goes in with a gun and he just shoots people and there's no consequences and it's all fine and they're just bad guys and hell opens and swallows them alive and a bag of gold lands in his lap. That would be ridiculous. No one's ever made a film like that. So the question of how the reward comes out is very difficult to say because in real life we don't get our reward in this life at all, and very few stories actually take place in this life, then in the afterworld, and then you show the guy being reincarnated as a mongoose because he lived an evil life previously. And then he's got to be a really brave mongoose and kill snakes to be reincarnated as a prince. And then I mean they just don't do that, you know. And I used a Buddhist or a Hindu example just to show I'm not talking about Christianity necessarily. I'm just talking about storytelling. Usually in storytelling, you don't see the results. You can't see the results beyond where the frame of the action is. So people can get away with killing a giant and taking his stuff and living happily ever after because he doesn't have a brother who will come looking for you. And I should say that in the Bible, which is lots of good stories in the Bible, the brother of Goliath of Gath comes looking for David afterwards, and he himself is another giant comes looking for David, and he's killed by another guy whose name escapes me at the moment, Eliud something. And I thought, wow, that's whether you believe in the Bible or not, that's a good story because it shows what would realistically happen. Whenever you kill someone, even a giant, even a monster, there's repercussions. There's consequences. Grendel has a mother. Yeah, even Beowulf. Beowulf is a realistic story because Grendel has a mother. So, you can see, as a science fiction writer, my definition of realistic is different from a Muggle writer about whether or not the moral consequences have weight to them. If the character's action has no weight, then it's just a daydream. It's just a fantasy. But here's what's worse. Here's what makes it even more difficult to answer the question is sometimes when I'm telling a story, or anyone's telling a story, let's not talk about me. Sometimes when a writer's telling a story, he has to simplify things and not show the complexities of what's going on. If I'm telling a love story and it's a Montague and a Capulet and they're going to fall in love, I only have 4 acts to do it in, then there's got to be one balcony scene and boom, they're in love. And anyone who goes, well, wait a minute, he should get to know her for at least 3 months before he kisses her hand. Well, I'm sorry, you don't have time during a play. You have to just assume the audience is going to take this as a symbol for what is really going on. So you have love at first sight, and they fall in love at the balcony scene, and it's done. See, a writer by definition has to do some unrealistic things. If I'm writing a superhero story, then I don't show. Let me give you an example. The first superhero cartoon ever done by the animator who did Popeye, I can't think of his name at the moment, Max Fleischer. In the Max Fleischer Superman cartoon, the evil scientist has a giant ray gun. He sends a note to the press saying, "I'm going to use my death ray on the town today." Superman goes out to the girl gets in trouble. The spunky girl reporter goes to his evil tower. Before she can say a word, he grabs her and ties her to a chair. And Superman comes out because of the job for Superman. The ray hits him. He punches the ray gun beam all the way back to the evil scientist. It blows up. He grabs the scientist by the collar, saves the girl, and in one leap leaps back into town. And on screen for less than a minute, less than a second, you see him take the bad guy, throw him in the jail, and the jail door slams shut. And the guy grabs the bars of the jail. There's no legal complexity involved in this story, okay? There's nothing you have to show about the voir dire process of seating a grand jury and then getting an indictment and then him objecting that the guy was in a costume who came to arrest him and where's your witnesses and what happens to my sidekick parrot bird who can apparently talk, whatever. You don't worry about those things, okay? You don't sweat the small stuff. So if I'm writing a story and I don't have the natural consequences of some bad act, that may be because I'm trying to put across the idea that I'm glamorizing that bad act, but it may be that the story logic doesn't allow me to dwell on that because that's not what the story's about. Okay?
That brings up something. I think that terms often pet peeve, but something of a pet peeve of mine, to use the phrase, is the complaint that so many people had against characters who were cardboard cutouts. And my complaint, or my pet peeve is this, that it was to massively misunderstand, I think, the problem with a character who is not fleshed out. And that is that a cardboard, like Darth Vader in the first Star Wars movie. We know practically nothing about him. And I've
What do
heard
you
the complaint.
mean? The moment he steps on stage, before he even says a line, you hear him breathing like an obscene phone call. He's got a skull mask. He's got a Nazi helmet. He's got a big black cape. Everyone who knows what a word crawl is knows what the guy in the black cape is. You know everything you need to know about him at that
Well,
point.
exactly, in fact. But what I mean is we get almost no exposition about him.
You don't need it.
Well, exactly. And this is where people who complain about cardboard cutouts, I think, um,
Well, it's also the kind of
tend to go
story you're
wrong.
trying to tell. That was not an investigation into the nuances of human psychology, or a gentle, thoughtful piece about man's relationship with God. That was a story about Buck Rogers, about
Mhm.
adventure, about a farm boy with a big dream, about a lovable rogue with a heart of gold, about rescuing a space princess.
Right.
And more to the point, it was nostalgia for Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, which in the '70s was a cup of cool water in an oasis of blast of hideous nihilism and cynicism. All the movies around it were so cynical.
Oh, no, it's fascinating to see just
Science fiction
how
movies were so cynical.
Saturday Night, the one that starts with Staying Alive, Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah.
That is an
I was
incredibly nihilistic
thinking
movie.
of I was trying to think of a science fiction movie from the same period was Logan's Run, which is all about everyone dies at 30. Okay, and the whole society is corrupt. And I mean,
If there's anything else that's
overwhelmingly
not
negative.
bad, it is.
Good old Soylent Green. Soylent Green is made of people. The world has been destroyed by overpopulation and pollution. Use the pill. It's an ad for the pill, but it's also grindingly negative. Whereas Star Wars was grindingly positive, and it was so
Mhm.
positive, and the audience reacted so immensely that as a science fiction guy, I love the fact that science fiction is now basically mainstream. I don't
Mhm.
know anyone who doesn't know who Mr. Spock is anymore. When I was young, only my people, the non-muggles, the freaks, knew what all about these things. It's all due to Star Wars. And what I think is funny is I thought Star Wars was basically a nostalgia trip, and that George Lucas himself didn't believe the message that was in the story, but the message was in the stories in the 40s and the 30s, where those chapter plays come from, where those cliffhanger serials come from. And so when he copied the thing over, he copied the message by mistake over. And then in later films, when he tried to do it himself, just using his own genius, he couldn't do it. He couldn't recapture the magic. See?
Mhm.
And then he blamed the fans, which I thought was a mistake. So that's my I was,
Mhm.
by the way, my one film credit is I was in a movie called The People versus George Lucas, and I was on screen for 1 second and I had one line, but I was interviewed for a George Lucas movie, a documentary about how the fans both love and hate George Lucas, and I'm a fan, and I love and hate him, so there we go.
That makes sense. But the reason I brought up Darth Vader is because he is given as much description as is necessary,
Mhm.
but there is nothing that we are told about him that contradicts him being a deep character. And so there is the space given for an imaginative member of the audience to fill in all sorts of possibilities. He is a character as presented that could be a full-fledged three-dimensional human being, and the story does not preclude any of that, but it also doesn't fill in any of that.
Well, it doesn't require it. I
Well,
mean,
right, but at the same time, the fact that it doesn't preclude any of that means that he is a perfectly realistic character the moment he walks on stage.
realism is overvalued. I myself don't think realistic characters are the be all and the end all, unless you're trying to write a character driven story. Most science fiction stories, especially most older science fiction stories, the focus of the attention is on the changes to society produced by technology, or the eerie magic that steps into our world from another world, and so usually the characters are relatively simple, because you want to have every man. You want to have Jack fight a giant. You don't want to have you know a giant fight a giant unless you're doing a Godzilla versus Megalon movie. So maybe that's a bad example. You want to have an ordinary person in an unusual background, or you want to have an extraordinary person in a usual background is usually what you want to do. Again, unless you're trying to do something like a cyberpunk story, which I actually thought that it was a stroke of genius of the cyberpunk movement in the 1980s to have extraordinarily odd science fictional people in extraordinarily odd science fictional backgrounds. And it was like a kitchen sink kind of story where you threw everything into the background.
Mm.
But excuse me, now I'm digressing. I'm getting away from your point. If you want to draw a distinction between a stereotype and an archetype, you can make a distinction between an unconvincing attempt at an archetype where the character is merely flat and a convincing archetype where the character has every detail. When you look at him from every angle, he's the same character. He never disappears into a two-dimensional line of a guy who's just jerking like a puppet through the motions in order for the plot to get to where it wants to go. Because I will point out that even in that first movie, Darth Vader has a few lines. He chokes a man to death during a meeting, or almost not to death, but he chokes a man during a meeting just to show what a tough cookie he is and what a bad guy he is. He mocks the Death Star as being a technological toy compared to the evil powers of the Force. The powers of magic is what he's talking about. The powers of awesome sauce is what he's talking about. And he is the old student of the wizard, the crazy space wizard. Okay, so there's an emotional relationship there that is automatically interesting. It's automatically dramatic. Oh, and he's the guy who killed Luke's father. So there's another automatic, you see, tension and dramatic tension between them. And by the time the second movie rolled around, all that is played up even more. I would list him as an archetype rather than a stereotype.
Right,
And
which was the point I was trying
with
to
an archetype, an imaginative viewer or reader can kind of fill in the details. You know what kind of music he likes. You know whether he votes Democrat or Republican. Based on how he behaves. You kind of know what kind of girl he'd be attracted to. If it's truly an archetype. If it is just a stereotype, those things, kind of would fit anything. And if he's just a Mark I bad guy, then you could argue that maybe Darth Vader is. Then anyone who wants to say someone else is a bad guy will say, well, you're acting like Darth Vader, which I do see people say. So I'm not sure how to characterize him, but I do think the categorization is still valid. That there's some ways of using characters that are simply flat and unconvincing, that they're merely there to force the story through its motions. And if you're a candid reader, you can kind of see the creakingness, and you don't really care for it, and it's a negative. But if it's someone like Tarzan, I would say is an archetype. I would say Conan the Barbarian is an archetype. I would say Dracula. I would say Sherlock Holmes. All these characters embody something, so that you feel as if you know them, even if you've never actually, read the books before. And what's interesting about characters like that is if you read the originals, usually there's more dimensions to them than is in the TV version, the movie version, or the film version. But here's the John Wright method for telling when something's an archetype or a stereotype. If more actors have played that character than any other character in the history of film, then it's an archetype. More characters have played Dracula than anyone else in the internet database. Okay. Second to him is Sherlock Holmes.
And Santa Claus.
Santa Claus was really high on the list too. There's been a lot of Santa Clauses on TV shows. So Santa Claus, once again, is an archetype.
And now, by the way, I would propose, and this isn't necessarily a good rabbit hole to go down, but I would propose that actually a precise way of not precise, but some of the technical detail of telling the difference between the two is that in the flat stereotype, what you have at some point are going to be contradictions in the character and what he does.
Certainly.
That aren't present in the archetype. That the archetype is always consistent with himself in his actions, whereas the stereotype is going to, I think, often by omission, he's going to his actions will contradict his character.
Well, now keep in mind that in order to make a character realistic, you have to build some paradox into him. If you want to make a three-dimensional character, that's the thing that makes him seem three-dimensional. So you and I might be talking about two different things. Because consider that Sherlock Holmes is a genius, but he also has to shoot himself up with drugs to dull his senses, because otherwise he sees too many details and it's too overwhelming to him. In addition to being a guy who solves crime, he also shoots VER, Victoria Regina's initials, into the wall of his apartment with his revolver. Okay, there's more to him than just the crime solver.
Right, but I don't think that's not a contradiction in his character. I mean, that's a contradiction of a trait, but not a contradiction in the character. Um, you
Well,
know, it,
if you define it that way, then I'll agree.
because
A character that contradicts himself is a poorly drawn character.
right, and that's where I think and you see that if you had a Sherlock Holmes character who was presented with an interesting puzzle and simply didn't care, not was doing something else that was even more important, or what have you, but simply just didn't get,
Or
walked
if you
right
had a
past.
superhero who broke someone's neck because he couldn't think fast enough to drag the guy out in space, stick his head into a bucket of lead, or cover his eyes with your hands to save the innocent people, then that would jar the viewers out of the movie, and they would complain about it for weeks and months afterwards, and never forgive you.
Mm. Yeah, that does sound. Should it ever have happened, like the sort of thing that would happen?
I'm just saying.
Yeah, but so like a show. If
But
you
I will also
introduced,
say, by the way, I'll say Superman is an archetype, not a stereotype, even though he's a very flat character. Nonetheless, the difference between Superman, the reason why he lives in the hearts of the American psyche is he dresses like an ordinary schmo. He gets into rush hour traffic. He wears a tie to the office. His crabby boss yells at him. Not as much as Spider-Man's boss yells at him, mind you, but he gets yelled at by his boss, and he can't get the girl because he's a Kansas farm boy, and the girl's a sophisticated New York girl. Okay, and the girl's in love with the Superman. It's one of the only it's the idea of a two-sided love triangle. Okay, and it was an idea that was so successful that everyone copied it. Green Lantern was in love with Carol Ferris. I mean, everyone copied the idea, but that was his idea because Superman doesn't get any glory, doesn't get any credit. I should say rather, Superman gets the credit, but Clark doesn't. See, and so there's something in the human heart that goes, what kind of man is it who would do all this for others and never get a reward, never get a dime, never get the girl, never get anything? See, it's very appealing. It's very appealing because he has the power of a god. I mean, he's is
yeah,
nearly infinite power.
with the
Uh,
case
there are
genius.
many people who regard him as a bad character because he can solve any problem. But assure you that if Lois Lane is starting to date Lex Luthor, there's nothing Superman can do with his X-ray vision or whatever, because those people don't understand what the dramatic appeal is of such a character. He's basically Hercules undergoing labors, undergoing labors for a. But be that as it may, Hercules is another archetype.
Yeah,
The Spartans made him into a god. He was that archetypal. So
yeah. It's. Have you ever seen? There's a short-lived comic, something City. Um,
Astro City.
yes, I believe it is.
The author of Astro City insulted me personally because I was a conservative Christian, and he
Really?
badmouthed me. Yeah, I was up for a
Oh,
Hugo Award, and because I was a conservative Christian, they all thought that I must have done something sneaky to get on the ballot. And my editor is I don't he's the most hated man in science fiction, and he also was trying to get me on the ballot. And Larry Correia, who is a fun-loving gun nut who writes wonderful books about. He writes books about if you want to talk about stereotypes and archetypes. If you have ever been in a horror story, uh, and you have a gun, suddenly shows like Cujo are over very quickly. Okay, so he wrote a story about people who armor up to go kick butt on the bad guys when they're werewolves and vampires and so on. And he's a funny guy and he's a good writer, and he was on the ballot too. And so was Sarah Hoyt, who also is a bit of a conservative. And now they all have things in their books that might be glamorizing violence, and Sarah Hoyt has homosexuals as main characters that glamorizes that kind of thing. And there are things in my books that I don't necessarily want my kids to read, especially some of my earlier books, uh, because of course I'm not necessarily writing about Oz. In Oz, there's nothing harmful or offensive. Oz are great books to read to kids. But if I'm writing about something that takes place in a realistic world, there's going to be some bad stuff happening. Uh, and that doesn't mean I'm glorifying the badness. But in any case, to make a long story short, the bad guys decided that we were the devil, and so they just lied about us, including lying to international press organs like the Guardian newspaper in England. My name showed up in someone's paper in England that I was being a racist, bigoted, homophobic, heterophobic, phobophobic, allurophobic, arachnophobic, claustrophobe, who was a bigoted bigot, filled with bigotry and filled with hatred. And the fact that I'm a Christian shows that I'm filled with hatred because, of course, Christ preached that you should hate your enemies and hate yourself at the same time. And so,
Hate your neighbors who hate yourself.
what's that?
Hate your neighbors who hate yourself.
You hate your neighbors, you hate yourself. Yeah, that's their idea of what I was. Now, my idea was that the Hugo Award should go to the book or story that had the most merit to it. Their idea was the Hugo Award should be awarded on the basis of diversity hire criteria, so that if it was preaching modernism, if it was preaching anti-Christianism, if it was preaching diversity, if it was preaching homosex, if it was preaching transphilia, if it was preaching anti-Western, anti-life, anti-reason, then it should get the award, especially if the author was also a member of a minority or two. Now, oddly enough, my faction had more minorities than theirs did, because they're stinking hypocrites. I don't mean to beat around the bush. But people who don't even know me, who are just friends with some of these people who were lying about me, and without even consulting me, made public statements that condemned me, and in no uncertain terms, as if they knew me personally and they had seen me plunge the knife over and over again into the innocent, pregnant nun that I then lit on fire. And the guy who does Astro City, a comic book I used to like and I used to admire tremendously, was one of them. So I unfortunately have to recuse myself from any comments about him, since I'm no longer an objective and neutral judge. I actually feel personally offended by the guy, but he would bother to pop off on a topic where he knew nothing about, just to stick his oar in and tweak my nose. Well,
very strange. I'd only ever read like 3 issues.
Not strange at all. He's a member of a group that has to maintain a certain spirit of unity, and you don't want to argue with your friends. I don't want to argue with my friends. Now I wouldn't pop off and just start insulting a perfect stranger that I knew nothing about, merely because my friends were doing a 2-minute hate. But I have to say, I don't like Emmanuel Goldstein any more than any other enemies of Big Brother. No, excuse me, I do not know anything about Emmanuel Goldstein, so I'm not going to participate in the 2-minute hate. Yeah, it's not strange. It's a little sad, but it's not strange. It's perfectly understandable.
I assume you don't like to quarrel with your friends, because I get the impression you do enjoy arguing with your friends.
I like quarreling with my friends. Yeah.
Anyway,
say that I like arguing with my friends. I don't like quarreling with them. If you can do it with no emotion involved, it's fine. If emotion gets involved, then you've lost you've deviated from the path of a perfect reason. Which since you want to talk about archetypes, Mr. Spock is an archetype of a perfectly logical man, but even he has a paradox involved in his personality, which makes him much more interesting than the other Vulcans that have come on stage in other Star Trek shows, in other shows in the franchise, because he's half human, and therefore he has to wrestle with his emotions, and he's secretly unhappy, but he hides it beneath a mask of stoicism. Now, that's an archetype. Let me tell you the difference between an archetype and a stereotype. An archetype is someone where, when you meet someone in real life, you compare him to the character in your head, and you go, that guy is a Scrooge. You see, Scrooge is an archetype. He's such an archetype that you can use his name as an adjective. That guy's a Scrooge. That guy's a Mr. Spock. See, meaning he's very logical and unemotional, very stoical, and so on. That guy's just a vampire. That guy's a Dracula. See how it goes? That's what a stereotype is. That guy's a barbarian. That guy's a Conan. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that guy's a Conan, though. I have heard people say that guy's a Scrooge.
Well, Conan, I think, changed the concept of the barbarian to some degree.
I don't know what it was beforehand, but the noble savage goes back to Rousseau.
It does, but Conan, I think the idea of the barbarian being specially mighty, especially powerful, especially brave, those things, because, historically speaking, those who couldn't speak Greek were not particularly better at fighting than the Greeks were. The Romans, obviously.
If you're going to use the word barbarian in that sense, then yes, you just mean non-Greeks. In the sense, remember, it's written in the 30s when everyone had just lost all faith in civilization and they were turning to FDR and fascist, Nazi, and communist leaders who promised that they could, by sheer dint of intellect, solve complex economic and social problems by means of the brain trust. And people had thought freedom had failed, that democracy had failed. And people are always hemmed in by civilization because you always have to, this was in the days when people wore coat and tie to go to a ball game. Okay, people wore a tie to go to a ball game. It was before the invention of air conditioning. We're talking about the 30s. It's the same. It's the same decade. It's almost the same year as the Shadow and the Lone Ranger came on the radio. Is when Conan the Barbarian stepped onto the pages of Weird Tales. And so I think that he was tapping into a very fundamental, very deep root in the human heart, where you go, I would just like to rip my straitjacket off and go screaming out into the woods and face someone who, instead of waiting for a voir dire and then a trial and then a judge and then a shady Philadelphia lawyer to get him off the hook, I will just punch him in the face and he will just punch me in the face, and whoever the last man standing is wins. You see, and that there's something, the idea that there's something corruptive and weak in civilization, that civilization is making us weaker. There is actually no scientific or historical basis for that. Okay, I'm sorry. It's just not true. A modern Marine, if you dropped him in the middle of the Stone Ages, they would not only would they all come up to hear on him, but he could lick them. He could pick them up with their feet and clean the floor with their heads. I'm sorry. The real Stone Age guys, they didn't have our nutrition. They didn't have exercise regimes. They didn't have a methodology for how to fight. They didn't pick martial arts methods from all over the world for 2,000 years and train your Navy SEAL team to do that kind of garbage. Okay, I'm sorry. Civilized men can trash barbarians every time. But the myth is, the reason why the story is appealing is because in our hearts we all go, if only I could throw aside this burden of courtesy and artificiality and politeness and regulations and laws and regulations and laws and just be a man. I could get the girl, I could hit the enemy, it would be easy. And the idea that the American Indians were more robust than us, that they knew something we didn't know, they were closer to nature, that they had a source of strength that we lack. That's a very common notion, and it's a good basis for a story. And I think that we all have some feeling that we've left Eden behind, and that there's a union with nature that we've lost. That being said, I don't think Conan himself is necessarily a good guy, because he is a reaver and a pirate and a thief and a blackguard. But I've been rereading the stories in publication order, and I was a little surprised because he starts out as a king. He doesn't start out as the naked barbarian guy you see like in the movies and stuff.
Yeah, just as a small plug, the series of blog posts you've been doing on that have been a very fascinating read.
I don't know if 2 counts as a series yet. It depends on when I have free time. So go ahead and plug it.
Still, I especially the first one, the Conan, the Order of the Phoenix is a very, very interesting.
No, that was a mistake of mine. It's actually called Phoenix on the Sword. I wrote down the wrong name. I wrote down like a Hogwarts name by mistake or something.
But anyway, shift back to the subject of morality. I think there's a very interesting.
Before you change the subject of morality, I'll point out that I think Harry Potter is also an archetype and not a stereotype, because while the mental image of a little wizard or a little witch who is a cute like Halloween witch, not like real witches that cause cattle famines and send diseases and suck the blood of children, not those witches, but but modern witches who are all young and cute and are on shows like Bewitched and Charmed and what have you. If you think of a young wizard in a pointy hat and a broom, nowadays everyone's going to think of Harry Potter first and foremost, because J.K. Rowling just captured something out of the several elements that were floating around, and by combining it with Tom Brown's School Days, she found something that had enough three-dimensionality to it. And of course, she does my favorite Dickinsonian method of getting you to like the main character, which is, kill off the mom on page 1, make him an orphan so you feel sorry for him. Because who doesn't feel sorry for orphans? It's like who has such a heart of stone that they look down their nose at Oliver Twist and goes, "Well, you're a little orphan boy. We have parents who love us, and you don't know what that is." That's one of my favorite lines from a Jackie Chan movie. It's the meanest thing I could think of any character ever saying to someone.
Huh. But which film? I've seen most of his stuff. Do you remember?
This was one of his American. It was Jackie Chan in the Shanghai Nights. And Jackie never plays a mean guy.
Oh no.
It was his motor mouth sidekick who said it. It was Owen, what's his name? The other guy.
Yeah.
Owen Wilson had the line.
What's funny about it is the actor didn't want to.
Oh, it was. I don't even know if it made it in the cut because I saw it on the extras, and he couldn't say the line because he kept breaking out laughing because it was so mean. It was so cruel thing to say to us. You're just an orphan boy. We have parents who love us, and you don't know what that is. Oh, it's so mean. Anyway, I love Harry Potter. By the way, I mean, when I read those books, I thought I want to have kids like Ron and Harry and Hermione. Those because they're likable. See, that's another thing that helps with story writing. And if your character is doing something if they're doing something sinful, it's harder to get to like them unless you're the kind of guy who wants to do that sin themselves. In which case, you get an added bonus, which may be some reason why some writers do that kind of thing. Yeah.
I have this feeling for a surprise. A lot of writers, that is. I mean, there are a strange number of, and I'm thinking possibly more television than in novels, but a surprising number of people seem to use writing fiction as a form of self-therapy.
I think those people are crazy. Let me give you one other kind of weird counterexample. I met another writer once who was doing a novelization of for Disney of Pirates of the Caribbean, and they got to use the Disney characters in their story they made up, but they had to, of course, clear it with them because the Disney wanted to make sure the characters acted. So Jack Sparrow the pirate, in her story, was smuggling ivory out of Africa from elephants killed by poachers. And the Disney Corporation said, "No, you can't do that." And she went, "He's a pirate. He kidnaps and kills people." They went, no picking on elephants. For pirates.
No showing him stealing anything.
I'm sorry, my wife remembers the story better than I do. You can't show him stealing anything. And she went, "He's a pirate." But he's a nice pirate. I'm a fan of a show called Naruto, which is a Japanese anime. Brilliant show. And they're all shinobi. They're all ninjas. They're all assassins. But they're nice assassins because the good guys never are hired to kill anyone. They're just superheroes. Oh, and One Piece is also a weird but very enjoyable anime that I like, where it's all good pirates. It's all nice pirates. Pirates who are nice guys. But now, I really don't think those shows are glamorizing piracy, because piracy is not something you can be tempted to do. If I wanted to be a pirate, where would I buy nowadays? Where would I buy a working warship? Back in the 1700s, a private individual, if he was rich enough, could afford a warship. But
well, you don't really need a warship to be a pirate. I mean, the Somali
ship with a big gun, at least. You at least need a ship that can prey on commercial shipping.
Yeah, well, the Somali pirates, I thought,
and if you're a member of a certain religion of peace, no one will criticize you if you commit acts of piracy off the coast of Somalia.
Mm. Well, but
no one in America will criticize you.
Yeah, but
sorry, if that's too political, I'll back off that comment.
Well, just to stick on the rabbit hole we're in, rather than going down a different rabbit hole.
I think I just lost your visual because I can't hear you anymore.
Huh. That's odd.
I lost you. I can't hear you.
Huh. This is rather annoying. Let's see. It seems to
I
be
don't know if it's my side or your side. You want to repeat it again?
Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I was just saying to stick on the rabbit hole we're in rather than to go down yet another rabbit hole. I think even in terms of glamorizing piracy, somebody who is merely a pirate but does none of the pirately activities is not really in very much danger of glamorizing piracy, simply because if anyone were to think, "Wow, I love the noble captain so much that I want to go become a pirate. I wonder how you do this." In the first 5 minutes, they'll discover that actual piracy bears no relationship to the thing that he looked up to, and discover that what he's actually looking up to is much more like joining the
Yeah, but if
Navy 100
you
years ago.
a hooker with a heart of gold, which I can think were the main characters, at least two films I can think of off the top of my head. They never actually show the taking money in return for copulation or being beaten by a pimp or anything like that. But they certainly do glamorize the profession by having the girl come on stage and be, a harlot with a heart of gold. In fact, excuse me, I can think of three. I think of three movies that do that. One is Gone with the Wind, one is Pretty Women, and one is Grace Little Whorehouse in Texas.
Hmm. I don't remember the. It's been so long since I haven't seen the third one. It's been so long since I've seen Gone with the Wind. I don't remember the prostitution in it.
One of the women who gives money to the cause is the keeper of the House of Ill Repute. Polite society doesn't venture, and of course, she still favors the Southern cause and is willing to give money, and she's got money because she stays open during wartime. If you've never read the book, I actually recommend it, even though most people will tell you guys don't read books like that. It's actually a war story, but it's a war story told from the point of view of the women who had to stay behind and nurse the wounded. It's portrayed as if it's a romance and that's the only thing there is involved in it, but there's more to it than that. And I could also make an argument that Scarlett O'Hara is also a archetypal character because she's the woman who swears to God she's never going to be hungry again. That is a defining moment of character development. That's really well done. She's a shallow character who gets deep, but as the story progresses, it's kind of fascinating.
Mm. Now, I think there's a difference between those two examples, though, because in the noble pirate, the nobility and the piracy are directly antithetical to each other. The pirate who would never take anything is directly antithetical to real piracy, whereas the hooker with a heart of gold is not so much antithetical as orthogonal. That she is able to be tender in some particular way.
I may have to concede the point because it occurs to me that if you're portraying anyone realistically, they're going to have good points and bad points. Anyone, if it's going to be a realistic character. If it's a heroic character that you're trying to make a simplistic hero, if you're writing a superhero, you want to have his bad points be as minimized. You don't want to have him. You don't have him hopped up on drugs like for example.
You want to have him turn in his homework.
If there's if you want to tell Mary Magdalene actually was a whore with a heart of gold. Okay, one of the saints in the Catholic Church is actually exactly that stereotype. So I'm not going to say you can't do it or it shouldn't be done, but your point I have to concede because of course when Belle is giving money to the cause, she's not doing it as a harlot. She's doing it because she's a patriot of the South, mind you, but still a patriot. And the idea that whores can't be patriots is bogus.
Now, Pretty Woman also is interesting in that, and it actually connects to the story of the woman who anointed Jesus' feet. In that, in Pretty Woman, she essentially, it's going a little far to say that she repents, but the story ends in her no longer being a prostitute.
Well, yeah, but I would say that a lot of the best stories.
So it's a form of repentance.
The reason why selling sin is not necessarily a good financial prospect in the long run is the really best-selling stories are stories about repentance and redemption. Everyone loves those, and everyone loves those from all over the world, from all of time, and they're really powerful. They get to the very root of the soul. They get much deeper than these other things like the desire to be a pirate or the daydream about being a barbarian and throwing your clothes to the wind and going out and wrestling a bear naked or whatever. Not that I ever had that particular daydream. Slitting throats as a pirate, though, that's something that appeals to me. Well, because you can kill people and take their stuff and drink rum and talk like John Newman. Aye, mateys. What's not to like? I got to tell you, I should write this story someday, but if I don't get around to it, either you or any of your listeners can have the idea freely. In real life, on our world, there were privateers hired by the British government to go into Southeast Asia and hunt down slavers. And they were privateers. They were pirates. So pirates versus slavers. Isn't that a great hook for a story.
That is.
In any case,
That would
any
go
story
for.
with any bad guy can be about redemption. That's one of the reasons why Vader became a more interesting character in the later movies than he was in the beginning. Because in the beginning he was just the bad guy, uh, and if the bad guy doesn't change or do anything, he's still just the bad guy. And he's a bad guy I like. I mean, come on, black cape, skull mask, Nazi helmet, kills people. I mean, he was ridiculously impressive. He was even more impressive, by the way, in Rogue One. They had a great scene that was just him doing bad stuff, killing a whole corridor full of soldiers. But that's not what's gonna tug on your heartstrings. See, I like shallow stories as much as the next guy. But shallow stories is like cotton candy. You eat it, you forget about it. It's nice. I will never turn my nose up at a shallow story. I don't think it's fair to dislike shallow stories in the same way it's not fair to dislike a sonnet just because a sonnet is not a stage play. The playwright has more scenes to work with than 14 lines. Okay. Uh, I'm a particular fan of comic book stories, and comic book stories I think are supposed to be a little shallow. They're supposed to go down easy. They're supposed to be quick and light. Now, I'm not saying you can't do deep. There's people who have done, but I don't think that guys who do deep should sneer at the guys who do shallow, and I don't think the guys who do shallow should sneer at the guys who do deep. I think we should both sneer at the guys who do shallow and pretend it's deep. That just annoys everyone, okay? Because you're not really all that deep. All you are is you're a member of the counterculture, and you're just praising sin, and you're having your girlfriend tell you to go sleep with a whore, and real girlfriends don't do that. So and you're trying
Yeah.
to, and who would lie to a child? That's what I disliked about to draw it back to the beginning of the conversation. What I disliked about Bob Heinlein is he knew he was writing in juvie, and he knew he was lying to children.
Mm.
Now, maybe he didn't know he was lying. Maybe he believed his own snake oil. I find that a little hard to believe, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he did. But still, man,
Yeah.
man,
Well, that
he could
actually
have ruined
brings.
my life. He could have ruined my life, and it was only by take your pick, random chance, the grace of God, happy fairies, that I did not end up, with a venereal disease or something. Thanks
Yeah.
to his advice that there's no consequences. Hey, no consequences. If you sleep with a woman and she gets pregnant, she'll kill your child in the womb. It's legal in America. It's your constitutional right. Well, okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Heinlein. Please don't get me to participate in a gruesome sin. And so, what can I say? The main problem is it's if you believe that mankind is fallen and is sinful, then you have a realistic view of mankind. You are a realist. If you don't believe in that, but you're cynical, you have a shallow, cynical view. And if you don't believe in that and you're optimistic, you have a shallow, optimistic view. And you can write perfectly entertaining space opera or comic books or other shallow books, but you can't write Lord of the Rings. You can't write War and Peace. You can't write the Brothers Karamazov. Okay, you can't get down to the depth you need to get to. Not that I can get down to those depths. I'm up here with the space opera. If I write a story and at least one planet doesn't get blown up, I feel like I'm a failure. So that's me. I'm not.
It reminds me of something Chesterton said when he was young, that the only thing he read were murder mysteries, and if there wasn't a dead body on the first page, he just stopped. Um, but he has a
if,
wonderful
if if
defensive.
if if an evil fairy wants to curse me with being as shallow as Chesterton, I will take that curse because I think he's one of the best writers ever. I really like him.
I'm quite
I
a
even look
fan.
like him, so I'm a big fan.
You
Yeah,
know, he's got a great defense of Penny Dreadfuls, by the way, in the book The Defendant, which is something, especially.
yeah, I've read it.
Oh yeah, it's something that strikes me as people get interested in Penny Dreadfuls, although they're more commonly called pulps in America. But anyway, and I say they should go around.
Well, Penny Dreadful was actually the generation earlier, but pulps are in the same vein.
Well, yeah,
And
they cut.
among the science fiction field right now, there's kind of a pulp revolution going on because a lot of the younger generation just found out that they've been horribly cheated of their pulp heritage. Because when the pulps were written, there were not strict boundaries between genres, and there was not this idea that you couldn't have romance in science fiction stories, and there was not these other ideas that have hindered science fiction and made it kind of this boring, socialistic, nihilistic, gray sludge of a genre that it's kind of turning into. Uh, the pulps were written in very bright, vivid colors, and if you read those guys, while they're often mocked for being shallow and simplistic, I assure you they are not. One of the
Mm,
best criticisms of uh, Plato's idea about communism and Marx's idea about communism come from two authors. One was Aristotle, and the other was Edgar Rice Burroughs. His green Martians of Mars raise their eggs communally, and so they have no love and affection for the creatures they're raising. They don't know their mothers, they don't know their fathers, and so they all hate each other, and they only live for warfare. And what did you expect if you are raised communally for the sake of the common good as a matter of duty, not because you have any personal affection for the creatures? The other one, Aristotle just said, if you raise the kids as if they belong to everyone, then they belong to no one. If you own property as if it belongs to everyone, then it belongs to no one, and no one takes care of it. People get the good of it, but they don't pay the price for it. They don't keep it going, upkeep it.
Mm. Yeah. So before I wrap up, I just want to propose the following idea as a way of telling the difference between fiction, which is propounding a bad message, and fiction, that's to say, vicious message.
Let's call it propaganda, between fiction and propaganda.
Okay. Yeah. To tell the difference between fiction and propaganda, whether intentional or unintentional propaganda.
Well, I think it's
in the sense of somebody who has swallowed their own snake oil.
But let's not, because you can't read someone else's mind. All you can see is their end product, so you can't tell if they believe it or they don't believe it.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say, is to not distinguish between whether they do or don't.
Whether they're trying to tell a story or trying to sell you a product, trying to sell you snake oil. That you can tell from the end product.
Right. What I mean is to lump the two, whether they believe it or whether they don't believe it, into the same group, so as to not try to read their mind.
I'm agreeing. Excuse me.
So
I should have interrupted to agree with you. Please ask me something. I'll try to retrain myself.
So I think the distinction that we had made earlier between the archetype and the stereotype, that same distinction, I think, is useful in telling the difference between these two. Is this something selling snake oil, or is it something which is not? In that they correspond, that the archetype corresponds to the relationship of the archetype corresponds to the to the real fiction.
Archetypes are to stereotypes as stories are to propaganda.
Right. Yes.
Because archetypes are alive, stereotypes are dead. Stories are alive, propaganda is dead.
Right. And in particular, the thing about, because snake oil will always have the property of containing a self-contradiction. Not a complexity as in the case of somebody like Sherlock Holmes, but rather a self-contradiction in that or it can be also be just a total incompleteness. But if it is an incompleteness, it's a sort of fun, leaving off the most important point, because if something is false to life, that means that something real is going to be affirmed, because you have actually existing characters or what have you, often human beings. But their actions and what happens within the story will necessarily contradict them being real characters. Right. If it is snake oil, simply because by virtue of being snake oil, it is false. It contains something false about human nature, or about the nature of logic or existence, or what have you. And so it seems to me a way to tell the difference between the two is that if the that one of the that being a difference, one of the common ways of telling that sort of false story is by actually there's two. One is by having just patently unrealistic results, so that's harder to tell if you're not sufficiently experienced. And the other is
it's also hard to tell in a science fiction story, because in science fiction, the writer gets to make up a completely unrealistic world that's supposed to be internally consistent, but it doesn't have to be. So you can't tell if the thing would work in his world but not in ours. I mean, Star, the sexy space empress, is supposed to be 1,000 years old. So maybe, and she's not a human being. She's not even from our dimension. So maybe she doesn't feel jealousy. Maybe she's actually a giant insect. She looks like a human being. You see the problem with that. So I'm not sure. Consistency is part of it, but I think part of it is the stiffness of the characters. Does it seem natural for that character, given the false effects assumption of what he's like? I mean, an elf. Would an elf really act that way? You see, it seems like a ridiculous question, and yet when I read The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, that's the way a unicorn would actually act. I don't think he's ever hitting me over the head with his political beliefs. at any point in the story, and I can't tell what his beliefs are. I can tell what his mood is and what his theme is. You know, I can tell he's trying to tell a story. You see, here's the difference. The artist, the novelist, serves truth. That's what our mission is. The propagandist serves the party. That's what his mission is. If I can read Homer 2 or 3 thousand years after he wrote, and I can say, "Dang, this is a good story," even though I do not believe in any of the gods that he believes in. He's not trying to sell me his gods, though. He's trying to tell a story about war and wrath and forgiveness. Okay, he's trying to tell a story of glory and pain, and he does it so brilliantly that almost all poetry in the West has been basically a footnote to him. He does a really good job of what he's supposed to do. But if I'm reading, even an author I like, I'll pick an author I like rather than one I don't like. If I'm reading Ayn Rand, she is writing propaganda. She sets up the situation to forward her goals, and there's nothing outside of those goals. There's no moment where the lecture stops and the person has a perfectly natural human moment. For example, Ragnar Dianaskill does not speak with a thick Danish accent. For example, I had him come on stage once in one of my role playing games, and I gave him a thick Danish accent. So under me, he automatically had more personality than he had under her. Now, I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying that I automatically added additional details. John Galt took a long time to make up the speech he was writing because he was an engineer, not a speechwriter. And so as an engineer, he wasn't comfortable with it, but he made himself do it. He forced himself to do it because he's the kind of guy who forced himself to do things. Well, that automatically gave him something interesting. It gave him a bit of a flaw. It gave him a bit of a paradox to his personality. See?
Yeah, well, an interesting thing.
Don't get me wrong, and I'm actually a fan of her writing. I think she did something that was brilliant, even though I think it was ultimately false to facts. I think it was ultimately a brass nickel. But it's a very beautiful, very well crafted, very intellectually crafted brass nickel. So
it actually did strike me that Hank Rearden's wife was served the plot, but was not a consistent character at all. When he gave her the piece, the bracelet made of Rearden metal, and she just laughed at him. And that it struck me as
I know women who act like that. So to me, she seemed very realistic.
Oh, there are people who act like that, but the thing is, she was portrayed as somebody who is primarily interested in human relationships, not in scientific things, and yet she showed no reaction. She showed no appreciation whatsoever. I mean, precisely no recognition of the fact that he was giving her something that meant a lot to him.
I think that Ayn Rand has a better grasp of psychology than you do, then, because I've met women and men who their sole goal in life is to cut other people down, and they take their only joy is Schadenfreude. Their only joy is making you feel less joyful, because they're like a drowning man who tries to step on someone else and shove them under the water to get their head above water.
There are such people. It just she didn't read to me like that.
I will defend Ayn Rand's villains to the hilt. I will say they're the most completely realistic villains I've ever met. I didn't used to think they were realistic until I started meeting people like that. Okay? It's her heroes that I don't really. I like Rearden better than John Galt, because Rearden at least has a personality. He's got a conflict. He's got he wants to leave his wife, but doesn't want to break his word to her. But he wants to go off with a girl he's in love with. It's a love triangle. That's it. Automatically interesting. So
yeah, well, she didn't strike me as her family struck me as the villains. She didn't strike me as she struck me as meant to be not a villain, but anyway, that's yet another rabbit hole for another time.
We'll have to have the Ayn Rand topic of some other day. Right now, it's hard to tell when an author is glamorizing something that's wicked because he needs it for the plot, and when he's actually trying to persuade you, the reader, to change your mind. Because I don't object to message fiction, but I object to the message fiction shoving the driver out from behind the steering wheel and throwing him out the window onto the highway, then grabbing the wheel and pulling the car into the opposite lane so that everything is sacrificed for the story. Even in the Heinlein story I was griping about, it's only that one scene, and you could cut that scene out without changing anything before or after, and the story would still be fine. It would still actually be an appealing story. Because the story is about a guy who wants to break out of his humdrum existence and have a real adventure and actually do something worthwhile with his life. You can't. I'm not going to mock anyone who writes a story on that theme. That's a great thing.
No, it is a good
I mean, who
theme.
doesn't feel
The
and more to the point, the guy goes on the adventure, gets the girl, gets the treasure, and then he finds out that there's more to life, and he's still not happy. Now, Heinlein wasn't willing to go the final step and to say what could make the guy happy. He just has the guy return to the thing at the beginning to be a hero again, even though that clearly was not enough for him in life. I think he could have, if he'd been willing to commit to the bit, if he'd been willing to take that final step, if he had been a Christian, he could have seen the deeper parts of the human soul that people who live on the shallows don't even think exist. So he would have been able to confront man's sinful nature and his need for redemption and his need for love and his need for reality in a way that would be deeper than just a guy gets bored after he gets everything he wants. Well, then logically, you should then ask, what is the nature of desire that your desires can't be trusted? Sometimes they lead you to what you want, sometimes they don't. Why is that? See, that would be a more interesting story at that point. But I mean, he wrote what he wrote, and it's ridiculously popular, and he's a bestseller. And I'm not. So who am I to? When you see the guy who can't run as fast as the Olympic athlete telling you that the guy's making a mistake in his running, you should be a little suspicious. So.
Well, that's true, but it depends too on.
Well, I'm also a reader, though. As a reader, I can have these opinions. I just can't have opinions as a writer. Oh, let me say one other thing about you talked about the difference between archetype and a stereotype and story and propaganda. I'll tell you a big difference. When I'm a story writer, I am a clown serving the king, and the king is my audience. There may be a lot of them, but they're still the king, and I'm still the fool. Okay, I'm there to make them laugh, make them think, make them smile, make them ha-ha. Okay, and in order for the joke to be funny, I usually have to tell about something that's actually profound, But if I'm in a shallow mood, and so are they, then I can just tell a shallow story, blow up a few planets, and everyone's happy. I mean, I've actually written stories that were deliberately meant to be pulp stories that were meant to be shallow, and they just sort of accidentally turned deep. I don't know why. But if I'm a propagandist, then in my heart, I think I'm a teacher. I think I'm your superior. I think I know and you're ignorant. And I think I got to teach you, and that you're so ignorant, I got to fool you by baiting my hook with a worm so it looks like I'm telling a story. I've got to tell enough of a story to make it palatable so I can slip the sucker punch in. I can slip the worm in. I've watched whole movies where the entire point of the movie was merely one or two throwaway lines to make fun of some political figure or to make fun of something I hold dear. And the whole rest of the story is perfectly good. And that little sucker punch was thrown in there just to make their worldview slightly more palatable by a tiny infinitesimal increment. And I've seen that over and over again. So much so that I almost can't watch superhero movies, superhero TV shows on the CW anymore because they all have Doctor Who. They always stop the story, have a little public service announcement for gay sex, biracial, bisexual, trisexual marriage, and then they go back to the story, which is usually a horror story. Okay, and they always stop and say, "Wait a minute, this is a horse who is trigender horse or something."
Yeah,
Every alien species has gay marriage on all their planets. Every planet, and Bob Heinlein did the same thing in the 20 Universes story that Glory Road takes place in. Star of the Sexy Space Empress says to Oscar Gordon, the hero, "Oh, and by the way, every planet but yours has free love. You're the only planet in the entire universe that has rules of morality." Well, I mean, come on. Okay, I can play the same trick. In fact, I did in my book, Some Wither. I had the evil aliens who were there to destroy all of human life and eliminate free will. Go, wait, you're from Earth, the only planet that we've ever heard of where you kill your young in the womb? Even the Aztecs that we made a deal with, who are our friends, they don't do that. They wait for the kid to be born first, because that way the gods could carry him away and make him a prince in Troy or something. We give them the Oedipus out, and you don't. You're terrible. Now obviously that was my little sucker punch. I mean, obviously I put that in for political reasons. Okay, sorry, I did. I thought it was funny also, because you don't know what the other planets are gonna not have that we take for granted. So I thought the guys, and these are guys, don't get me wrong, these are bad guys saying this. These are guys who expose infants in the wild if they don't want them. It's a girl baby, we'll just leave her in the forest. And if the gods want to save her, they'll send along a farmer, or she can be raised by wolves. You see, and for them to look down on us, I thought it was funny. I'm sorry, I forgive my sense of humor, but I did.
Yeah, well, it I mean, frankly, does seem
But
funny, by the
but
way.
it's only one line, and it's a throwaway line, and I put it in there as a sucker punch. Okay, there I confess, I'm actually doing something I disapprove of. The muse made me do it, but I see this in superhero shows all the time, over and over and over again.
Well, a
You know,
lot of those actually
until
strike
it's
me. I
like they
mean,
don't care if they sell the book anymore. They just want to make sure that when Iron Man's a black girl and Falcon's a black guy and Iceman's a homosexual, even though he was dating women before in books I've read. They're dealing with characters who are 50 and 60 years old, and suddenly they're all not good enough anymore. They're
yeah,
too problematical because they're white males. I mean, come on, that's propaganda. That is them not. They're not serving the truth. They're not serving the muse.
yeah. Well, in some cases, they even seem like they have to throw things in simply as a way of apologizing for telling the stories that they're telling. Yeah, apologizing to people on their own side for telling the stories that they're telling. It's a major problem.
Their side doesn't like their side doesn't like heroism, and they like it if the heroes are treated ironically or they are something for kids and not taken seriously. But I
Exactly.
assure you, I've written for grown-ups and I've written for kids. It's hard to write for kids because kids are a tougher audience. They don't take no guff from nobody. Okay.
I believe it. Oh,
Well,
one.
they're closer to reality than the grown-ups are.
Mm,
I mean, I hate to say it, but they are. The grown-ups make up a lot of gibberish in our minds to act as insulation from reality. When I say reality, I mean our sinful nature. Most children haven't committed murders and adulteries, or I mean, they stole cookies. Okay, they ripped a toy out of their brother's hand. Okay, yeah, they do. They have done some bad things, but they
mm,
don't have as much time and as much smarts to make an entire what's the word narrative. The old word for that is lies. The word in English is lies. The word in Newspeak is narrative. I don't know because I can translate between Newspeak and American. So they don't have enough time to make up a bunch of lies about themselves. But
mm.
once you're addicted to lies, once you're in a narrative, all your stories are going to follow that narrative, and that makes you a bad storyteller. Because a storyteller is supposed to tell you a story about reality, not about your personal opinion. And it's even stories that make you uncomfortable because it challenges things in your personal opinion. So, and maybe challenges the reader too. You're actually doing a person a service if you do it that way. Now these guys take that idea and they say, "Well, I'm challenging you when I'm throwing my political beliefs in your face that you don't agree with." And I'm going, "Well, I mean, if you're telling me a real story about a real person, that would be fine. If you tell me a story about Achilles and Patroclus, and you say, okay, they're homosexuals, and when Patroclus dies, when he puts on Achilles' armor, and Achilles is enraged and has to go out and kill the enemy, I'm sorry, that's a good story. And my personal opinion about you know the sexual matter doesn't enter into it. He's a real person. But if you're going, well, Iceman, who's an X-Man, he and you've known him for 60 years, suddenly he's gay, and now he's going to have a storyline where he's going to go talk to his parents, and they're going to react like parents from the 1950s, not like parents from 2017. Are you kidding me? That's just you preaching, and you're preaching, and it's a God I don't worship. Okay, I don't worship your gods. I don't care about your preaching. Just tell me a flippant story. I don't have to agree with the story. I like Homer just fine. I do not worship the Greek gods. I like Milton just fine. I am not a Puritan. I like who else do I like? I like those two guys the best. I like
Well, there's plenty of
Brothers
Japanese.
Karamazov just fine. No, actually, I hate Brothers Karamazov, but it's a really deep story. It's too deep for me.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a
So,
number of
I like
Japanese anime.
Europe is too smart for me. So I even like books written by smart people, and they're not books written by people who are dumb pretending to be smart. They're actually books by guys who are smart, who have some insight into human nature. Man, he's good. So the
By the
moral of the
way,
story is, if you read Gene Wolfe, you won't get any of this rotten propaganda stuff. So that's the more read Gene Wolfe, read J.R. Tolkien, and then just pick other books that are like those books if you can find them. How's that for an answer? You can tell it's getting late because I'm getting a ridiculous answer here.
no, it's good advice. One sort of final thought you had mentioned. You brought up Star actually as being different species with different characteristics, and actually this is something I've seen in criticism of the book Twilight, where the vampire in Twilight, the sparkly vampire in Twilight, had a habit of sitting there and watching the main character while she slept, and he used his telepathic powers
Can I
to
ask you a
keep her.
question? Can I ask you a
Mhm.
question? I haven't read the book because I'm a guy, and I haven't read any of the criticism because I'm a guy. Did the person write the criticism? Was it a 14-year-old girl? Answer yes or no.
No.
Okay, ignore him. He has no idea what's romantic. He has
Uh,
no idea. That's a story about redemption. I haven't even read it, and even I know that. That's a story about finding the good in a bad boy. And every girl wants to find a good in a bad boy. That's what they're designed to do.
yeah, well, sort of. This wasn't. This was an adult woman, a young adult woman.
Sorry, my
Um,
wife was talking in the background, and she takes priority over you, so I didn't hear what you said.
no, quite fair. But this was. It was a woman in her 20s, late 20s. So,
Well, I'll give it to her. Late 20s, yeah, she could still
but
read
no,
my
her
message.
criticism was mistaken. Though, and my point is about how her criticism was mistaken. So
Well, what was the criticism? Was it that he was not supposed to protect her? That women are
well,
not
that
really
the
cute when they sleep, and you would look at them if you could? What was the
well, it
criticism?
was that the vampire that he had to know where she was at all times. And it was brought up, the criticism was that this is one of the signs of an abusive relationship, a person who cannot stand you being outside of their knowledge. And
uh,
here's
did
the
she vote Democrat or did she vote Republican? Because I bet I can guess
yes, you're correct.
if she uses that
Anyway,
terminology.
no,
You know why?
you're entirely
Because
correct.
that her criticism is part of a narrative.
Yes.
It's part of a convenient system of lies that she tells about the human sexual animal, which are false to facts. Human sexuality is messy and dangerous, and the reason why people like me think you should get married before you have sex is because that minimizes the danger. It's like putting on a safety belt before you climb into a car, putting on a flight suit before you climb into a rocket. Okay, and sex will carry you further than a rocket will. Believe you me, I have kids. I know.
Yeah. No,
So
no, that's
so
quite true.
she
Although,
was simply offended because Twilight offended her idols, and so she was
well,
coming out to defend her cult. And I don't know her. I
yeah.
haven't read the article. I have no idea, but that's what it smells like to me because I'm very suspicious of this kind of thing. If you're going to criticize a romance novel, especially a romance novel for young girls, for 14-year-olds, on the basis of it being abusive, if the guy acts masculine at all, if the
Well,
guy if Superman saves Lois Lane, that's abusive.
there's
Weren't there evil vampires
it's
looking for her or werewolves trying to kill her too? I haven't read the
not
book. I
yet.
don't know.
Not yet in the story. It's there. Well, here's the thing, because it's a slightly more subtle point.
Okay.
Because this was literally he did essentially um, he did what had he been human would be stalking, in that he literally kept track of her in times when, in theory, she should be safe, but he nonetheless had to know where she was literally every moment of the day. But there are, however, and that level of extreme, being that incredibly extreme, where there is literally no trust whatsoever, even for her in what should be safe circumstances. That level of extreme surveillance would, in
Have you read this
perfectly
book?
normal life,
Have you read the book?
uh, the relevant portion of the book, yes. And
Okay.
it was extreme. I mean, he did literally keep track of her every movement, but there are two mitigating factors in the story which do not apply to real life. One of them was that this is a woman who managed to get severely injured running through a forest because she could not keep upright sufficiently. Like literally, like running along through a trail, she kept tripping and hurting herself so much her knees and her hands were bleeding when she came out of it from running through a forest.
Uh,
This is also a woman who, at one point, when she feared some people were going to attack her, just stood her ground to fight because she knew running on flat, level, paved ground was hopeless. She would guaranteedly trip and be overtaken. So better to stand her ground than be overtaken when she had fallen down and gotten injured. So she's a person who should probably have been wearing a crash helmet, as the story is told, and knee pads and elbow pads and wrist guards and so on. So she was literally unrealistically in danger all the time. And two, he was a vampire, not a human being, and so keeping track of her in this manner was a relatively simple exercise of his magical powers, not a complete reorientation of his life from what a human being should be doing, such as,
I have a rule of thumb. If I'm reading a criticism of a book and they use a word or a term or a phrase or an idea that didn't exist 100 years ago, I am automatically suspicious that the reviewer or the critic has an ulterior motive. If I haven't read the scene and you have, if it was meant to seem creepy, then fine, it was creepy. If it was meant to seem romantic because he's caring for her, because he loves her, and he has to fight against his own evil blood-sucking nature to do that, to even be in the same room with her, that's romantic in a way that young girls understand better than any guy with a beard is gonna, any old man with gray in his beard is gonna understand. Okay, there's something nice about that, even though it's supposed to be slightly dangerous because he's a bad boy, he's a vampire, he's.
Mhm.
And uh, back in the day, 100 years ago, if the guy was a masher or a cad, then yes, you'd object, and the woman should slap his face, and her brother should go beat him with axe handles until his bones are broken, or whatever. I mean, the way they handled it back in the day, fight a duel and end up both in jail or dead. Those were the days. Those were good old days. Uh,
Mhm.
but aside from that, having not read the book, I like the Heinlein comment. I have to recuse myself and say, if an evil fairy wants to curse me with the vile curse of writing such a bad scene that I sell 1/10 the number of books as the Twilight series, I will welcome the evil fairy's curse. Are you kidding me? I mean, that series was everywhere. It took off. It hit the ball out of the park. And you
Mhm.
can say, well, it was bad, but when you say that, you got to say, well, human nature is bad for liking. The audience, doesn't know what it likes, and I know better than the audience. I am never going to say that, okay? Because I'm a servant. I'm the fool who serves the king. I'm not the lecturer. I'm not the teacher.
Dylan,
I'm not the philosopher.
but Kirsten, who
Yes.
is a YA
Well,
librarian,
the mic is open. You can.
our friend Kirsten, who's a YA librarian,
Yes, oh Lord. I'm hearing voices. Are you hearing the voices? Is the mic picking this up?
commented to me in 2006 that she'd read this book that was about to come out called Twilight, and it was basically that it and one other book were the best books she'd read all year. If you compare Twilight to other things written for girls at that level, you no longer question why it's so popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
also, I got the impression, like I said, I didn't read the book, but I got the impression that Bella was kind of like an every girl, that every girl reading the book could put herself into Bella's shoes.
Every YA girl is like that. They're all gothics. They're all this every girl who has things happen to them.
yeah.
Twilight
The
stands out because she's more personality and
Let me
has
tell you-
more happen to
Let me tell you the application of my 100-year-old word rule. The first thing I ever heard about the book Harry Potter, which has sold, I've never even heard of a book that was so popular ever. Even when Dickens was writing, and people would go down to the docks to wait for the ship from England so they could get the next installment of David Copperfield or whatever on the ship, was not as much as the furor I saw when they had midnight openings of bookstores, and it made the nightly news every night. 4 more days until Sorcerer's Stone comes out or whatever. Okay, the first thing I ever heard about Harry Potter is someone criticized it because the little boy, was disrespectful to his elders and took risks and didn't wear a helmet when he was flying on a broom or something like that. And I said, okay, I don't remember what the word was he used, but it was something like risk averse, insufficiently risk averse, or something like that. And I said, okay, that criticism is less than 100 years old. So I assume this guy is trying to promote a narrative. That is to say, I assume he's a liar. So the book is probably really good. So I will test it out and I'll read it to my wife on a long car trip or something because we read kids' books. I like them. And we'll find out what happens. And it charmed me. It won me over. Okay. And I'm a pretty cynical guy and I don't really, like little punky kids in pointy hats. But I mean, he killed his mom on page one. What can I do? I mean, the kid was a nice kid. And I've heard other writers complaining, and they wonder why their books are not as popular. Well, there's several factors involved. One of which is, the fates, God Almighty. One factor is likable characters. I've read other books that had kids going to magic school. I mean, I've read Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Excellent book. I recommend it. But Ged Sparrowhawk is just not as likable as good old Harry Potter. So, because Ursula K. Le Guin is not trying to do the Tom Brown School Days thing where the kid was picked on. He's both rich and famous and yet picked on. Okay, so you get the best of all. You get the best of both worlds in that. And the idea that's similar to the daydream about finding out that you can join a pirate crew and just start slitting throats of the people that annoy you, or the daydream that you can just throw your books into the air and run off into the woods and be a barbarian. The daydream that some giant is going to come to you and say, by the way, you're magical, you're a wizard. That's a great daydream. That is a great hook because we all know there's something more to life than what we can see around us. Okay? Everyone secretly knows that. Even crass materialists know that. Otherwise, they wouldn't read books at all. They would just program themselves to have whatever reactions they need to have with their programming. So everyone knows there's something more to life than what we can put our finger on. There are things like sunsets and babies being born and women smiling that do have magic to them.
By the way, the reason I brought up the criticism I did, because I think you made valid criticisms of it, but my point was a bit different, was that the criticism did not take the character seriously as himself. That it criticized the vampire as if he were a man, not as if he were a vampire. And that, I think, is also a very good sign, a very accurate sign of a criticism that is not worth taking seriously. That is
but
related.
Do you agree with that criticism, even though I haven't read it? Do you agree with that criticism was selling a narrative? It was trying to put across a certain view of human sexuality that was not the view in the book?
I would say more it was sold a narrative than selling a narrative. Passing along something it already bought. It bought several copies of the narrative and was handing them out for free.
You and I are not mind readers, so I'm not asking whether you thought she believed it or not. I'm just asking you whether she was in the service of Uncle Screwtape, trying to get women to mistrust and mislike men, especially manly men who are a little dangerous. Because that's one of Uncle Screwtape's main deals he's trying to do these days.
Yeah,
there's very few manly characters in modern fiction. I'm a little surprised. So you'd think that would be a mainstream.
Well, I bet you there are far more in romance novels, which is sell.
Oh, I've heard somewhere. I heard somewhere that someone counted it up based on Amazon searches for books, and the top 5 characters for women's fantasies about romance were vampire, werewolf, physician, pirate, and I think Indian brave. I'm not sure about that last one, but or barbarian or something like that. It was all guys who were really guy-like, but physician was one of them because, of course, they're rich and they're powerful and they're they've got a lot of chops. They got a lot of oomph, the same way a vampire does.
Yeah.
Well, no, and they're also dangerous. They're also too big for you.
Yeah, no, it's true.
I mean, in men's stories, you have to go back to the thing I like about the pulps is if you read Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, he falls in love at first sight with the girl because you want to get on with the action. You don't want to have a long love scene, and she spurns him because they don't understand each other. But she's a princess and he's just a guy. See, so in the male fantasies, he's marrying up. He's rescuing Princess Leia, and he's just a farm boy. In the female fantasies, she's got to marry up too because she wants to get the prince. And if there's no princes around, she wants to get the high class guy. If there's no high class guys around, she wants to get the vampire who is a supernatural being, but is wicked. But if she can understand him and understand his heart well enough, she can turn him. She can change him. She can bring him to the good side, the bright side. And everyone who doesn't want to do that if you're a girl? I mean,
Yeah. The particular narrative I don't think is quite accurate to this criticism. It's a common one, but I don't think this one was.
I didn't read the criticism. I'm just speculating. Why?
Yeah. No. I understand this one had more to do with the narrative of I think in general the narrative of mistrust. One of the sort of narratives going around is the idea that no human being should ever trust another. And
well, I don't know it says that, so why should I trust them to believe their narrative?
It's related to the atomization of the individual.
I'll have to say that when you say the critic was not treating the character as if it was the real character, but only as a stand-in, the critic was treating the character in the scene in a shallow fashion to make a point. And the reason I'm saying that is I've had that happen to me. The very first criticism I ever got for any book I ever had published, all the critic did, and I won't mention names, is act as if everything I said was a symbol or a stand-in for something else. not as if I, as the writer, intended those things to be as real and as realistic as possible, given my science fiction, false to facts axiom that I was dealing with. So
Yeah.
the person just sort of assumed and read into it, and it was such uh, uh, they had to use a shoehorn to force their bogus interpretation into the words I had written, and it was quite painfully, clearly, an attempt to merely use me and my writing as an excuse to make a statement about their narrative that they wanted to promote. So they weren't dealing with truth; they were dealing with narrative. They were dealing with propaganda.
Yeah, and I think that is a good indication of where a person is doing it, that their narrative is more important than the narrative they're looking at. Whether they're the author or whether they're a critic, they refuse to consider the narrative as a thing in itself. It's only a vehicle for the one narrative they tell
Well,
throughout everything.
they don't deal with real people that way either. They're just too shallow to deal with it on a deep basis. I mean, I hate to condemn an entire half the country, but it's the shallowness is very appealing. I write shallow things myself. If you've ever read Michael Moorcock's criticism of J.R.R. Tolkien, it is a poorly written criticism, but it's memorable because both the author and the person being criticized, both the savager and the savagee, the savager and the victim are famous. And Michael Moorcock actually started his own genre of science fiction called New Wave science fiction in the 70s with New Worlds, a book from an English magazine. And but Michael Moorcock's criticism is based on treating the hobbits as if they are meant to be very simple two-dimensional stereotype stand-ins for a certain symbol, for a certain political view that is simply not present in the work, which is much more multi-layered and much more complicated than that. If you read Tolkien with even one eye open, you can see that he does not necessarily approve of the fussy stay-at-home busybodies that the hobbits are. It's the hobbits who are dissatisfied with their comfortable life, who look at the far horizons like Bilbo and Frodo, who get the author's glance of approval. And more to the point, it's the hobbit that is the low class guy, the gardener, who soldiers on when everything around him fails. Sam, who's actually the real hero of the book. Okay, and there's no way that if you read that to be glamorizing even middle class English Edwardian propriety, and you think that's what the book's about, boy, you are not reading the same book as I'm reading. You're using the book rather than entering into the book. You're trying to wrap your head around the book rather than walking into the book and letting it wrap itself around you. And of course, if you try to stuff a book that's smarter than you into your head, your brain will burst. If I can misquote a line from G.K. Chesterton, it'll drive you insane.
Yeah.
Now, the funny thing is, you started this conversation by asking me about how to tell books from propaganda, but so far, all I've talked about and all we've seemed to identify is how to tell good criticism from bad criticism. The good criticism actually takes the book on its own terms and criticizes it, doesn't succeed at what it's trying to do, and do you think my readers are going to like it? And those are two different things. I can look at a book that I shouldn't say. Let's not talk about me. Any honest critic can look at a book that has a point of view he doesn't agree with and still see whether it is well constructed or poorly constructed, whether it achieves the goals it's trying to achieve or whether it betrays those goals, whether it is honest or whether it is propaganda. Those are things anyone can tell. Now, you can separate your personal taste. You can say, this is a well done horror story, but I don't like horror stories. That's a perfectly feasible way a critic to act. But for a critic to go, this story glamorizes the free market, and I'm a socialist, so this story is bigoted. That's a dishonest reading.
Well, there's actually a weakness there's a very common human trait to assume that everybody else is like oneself, and so people who have an extreme...
I have that trait, and I assume everyone has that trait. Assuming everyone's like me, because it's a trait we all...
It is observationally as well a very common trait.
He
Um,
smiled, so I hope you understand. You understood that was
yeah,
a
I did get the
joke,
joke.
but it was
Um,
also a subtle criticism of the comment.
well, but it's by observation. It's not just uh, by generalizing, but observing where this happens. Where a person assumes everyone else is like oneself, and one has an incredibly reductive narrative, um, where everything, where uh,
What I called
and
shallow, a simplistic worldview that's either black or white. Everything is either angels or devils, and nothing in between.
yeah,
No
and
human.
and moreover, where one lives, especially where one lives a life where this is the key to achieving utopia or plunging into hell, especially
Right.
an earthly utopia. Um, then that because that last part places a huge importance on bending everything in the world to the goal, and where those three things intersect, it also forms an element in which if a person is not actively promoting the sought after utopia, the social solution to all of the world's problems, um, they then clearly must be on the other side, because anybody who had this idea would be bending all their efforts to really hammering
Right.
that idea home. And so I think this also generates a fair amount of um, mistaken readings of things, simply because it forms that lens of is this advancing the utopia? Because if it's not clearly advancing the utopia, it must be a work of the enemy. So I think it that there's some particulars to common narratives that people have, which make for even worse criticism.
Uh, Leftism is a death cult. And I hesitate to use the word leftism because they change their name every 10 years once people catch on to what they're selling. They used to call themselves socialists, but then that became unpopular and they called themselves communists, and then they called themselves liberals, even though they don't favor human liberty. And then they called themselves progressives, and then that word got worn out and they called switched back to something else. And I'm not sure what they're calling themselves now. But there is a large body of Morlocks who are anti-West, anti-white, anti-American, anti-law and order, anti-chastity, anti-Christ. And there is a wide number of Eloi surrounding them who have no idea where the Morlocks are leading them, but who like the sound of the promise that if you believe in us, there'll be no wars, there'll be nothing to fight over. If you don't have an opinion, you can't have any clashes of opinions. So if you accept the consensus view on everything, then Big Brother will take care of everything for you, and you'll be well fed and happy, and you'll be in a safe space where no adverse opinions can come across you. And part of this narrative nowadays, it recently developed a sinister mutation where it says, if you disagree with me, then that is the same as violence.
Mm.
If you express an opinion that questions my false beliefs. If you dare ask me a question like Socrates, then I am authorized and I'm legitimately able to use the law to punish you and even to kill you in my own self-defense. And I should riot. I should actually go out into the streets and smash up Starbucks and of course Starbucks is on your side and banks. Most bankers are on your side too. Now the narrative is hysterical these days because back in the days when communism was still running Russia and the Chinese were still not half and half communist capitalists when they were still full communist, it was possible to fool yourself into believing that the atheist utopia was right around the corner. All we need to do is kill another 100,000 people, and once the bad people are dead, we'll be fine. It is now no longer possible to believe that. So they have to switch who the scapegoat is from the capitalist to the white straight Christian male. And so now whiteness is problematical instead of capitalists being problematical. They and once they do this, they have a very simple, stupid myth, and the stupidity is the selling point because it's so simple. Even an intellectual can understand it. The good guys will produce utopia because of evolution will force us into a higher and higher plane of existence. Anyone who opposes us is in favor of the suffering, the crime, and the war that the utopia will solve. Now, no one is in favor of evil for its own sake, so they must be people who get temporary, unfair, and vampire-like advantage out of the current social system. They are the lords. They are the fat cats. They are the privileged class. And their real motive, which only I can see because I can read hearts like God Almighty, their real motive for asking you any questions about your stupid opinions is because they hate you and they want to undermine your faith in atheism, in the utopia, and promulgate pain, fear, and unhappiness. They are, in fact, devils. Therefore, anything they do is wicked. So if a devil writes a good book, he's doing it for the sake of hell. He's doing it because he's a bad guy. And you can't read his book because he might convince you of something. It's against the faith. Okay? And these are the people who refer to Christians as being, they call themselves the reality-based community, and they call Christians superstitious. Okay? Whatever, dude. Um, there is a cult, there's a death cult that has been pestering the West for at least 100 years. It's mutated several times and changed its name several times. And surrounding this death cult is a group of useful idiots, a group of people who are innocent and kind-hearted, who are told that in order to be kind-hearted, you must believe in the utopia, and that salvation does not come from Jesus, it does not come from the Torah, it does not come from the Buddha, it comes from Caesar, it comes from the government. Only the government will save you. Now, if you buy into that narrative, that stupid narrative, that simplistic narrative, that black and white narrative, then you think anyone who mistrusts the government is a bad guy, is someone trying to stop the problem from being solved because they like the pain and suffering. That's what all the people of this cult say about people like us, people like me. I don't know about you. And that's what they believe or pretend to believe about us. I don't know if they actually believe it because it's so dumb, it's hard for me to believe they actually believe it. But I know that not everyone thinks like me. So, so I don't know whether, and I'm not a mind. I don't care whether they actually believe it or not. If a guy is drilling holes in the lifeboat because he wants to swamp the boat, or because he thinks he's going to strike oil and save us all, I don't care why he's drilling holes in the boat. The boat is going underwater if he successfully drills a hole through the bottom. Either way, so I don't care what's in his heart at that point. I leave that up to wiser minds than mine.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting thing, at least that I've noticed about that literature of the socialist, communist, etc., was always revolutionary literature.
Yeah.
You know, like back in the days when George Orwell was a socialist and writing essays about how to write better socialist propaganda.
Yeah.
It was revolutionary. It was never utopian. They never told a story about what life would look like in this, if the goals were achieved.
He was a better writer than he was philosopher, as was Ayn Rand and as was Leo Tolstoy. I have a theory that there is a muse that inspires writers to write, but there's also a daimon, a demon, that inspires philosophers to do philosophy. And I say daimon, I mean the Greek idea. It just means a spirit. It doesn't mean a bad spirit. It doesn't mean a wicked spirit. And the reason why I use that is because Socrates said that he had a daimon that asked him questions that provoked him to do philosophy. But I've come across at least those three examples of writers whose muses were better than their daimons. Their writing was better than their philosophy. And Orwell, as a socialist, was one of them because by the time he rolled around to writing 1984, he laid out, he struck the archetype. Big Brother is an archetype. We can use the words Orwellian, in common conversation these days because we know exactly what he's talking about. We know what newspeak.
Oh yeah.
But even back when he was a socialist, his writing talent, his muse told him, there's no drama in utopia. See? There's no. Even when I wrote a book set in utopia, I had to make it a near utopia because otherwise there's no drama. The story's over too quickly if all problems are instantly solved.
Well, there's an interesting topic there, but
and also because Marx said you're not allowed to speculate as to how the socialist utopia is going to work.
Well, that's
one of the doctrines of the cult. And because if you do speculate about it, you can see that there's no price system, and therefore there's no way to calculate rationally what goods and services are in demand and what are not in demand, and what raw materials are in demand and what are not in demand. And so you can't categorize the higher priority versus the lower priority uses for any good or service. That means you're doing things that are completely chaotic and arbitrary. That means that socialism as a system is not only not a way to plan an economy, it by definition makes economic planning impossible.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's why Marx said you're not supposed to speculate about the socialist utopia.
Yeah, that's an awfully convenient one, that prohibition. But the just the thing I want to bring up about the revolutionary literature versus the actual utopian literature is
Well, let me give you a counterexample. Have you ever read Ralph Bellamy's Looking Backward? It's almost
no.
unreadable, but it's interesting only as a historical curio. It was a guy who falls asleep in an H.G. Wells fashion, and he wakes up. I mean, excuse me, like H.G. Wells' sleeper story. I forget the name of it. And he wakes up in the future, and everything is now socialist and perfect. It's just a travelogue. The guy just wanders from one place to another while Virgil is not his name is not really Virgil, but he's the guide. He's like Dante's guide through hell and purgatory and paradise, pointing out to him with the things around him how the social utility works. Almost unreadably boring. But it was. Go ahead.
I was going to say that sounds like the exception that proves the rule. That one person having tried it, everyone else had the good sense to not.
To avoid it. Right.
But the thing about the revolutionary literature.
Huxley, the guy who wrote Brave New World, also wrote a book called Island, where he was trying to show what his socialist, semi-socialist opinions would look like if put into practice. And it's basically a guy lands on the island and he's shown around and people point things out to him. Thomas More's Utopia is exactly the same way. It is a blank, barren description of a guy who lands on an island where there is a utopia. It's all Puritans, of course, who have no use for gold and who are all brave and stalwart like Spartans. And it's just a static description of their institutions. But Thomas More is a subtle writer, and he's writing a little bit tongue in cheek, and you can see a little bit of he doesn't. I don't think More believed in the utopia he was depicting as feasible. I think he was trying to make a point about. Well, never mind what I think about utopia.
Well, even the name.
It's almost a science fiction book,
Yeah. I do think the ability to tell stories with perfect characters is I mean, C.S. Lewis actually did introduce it, although granted it was the interplay between the perfect and the imperfect characters in some of Lewis's works. But without going down that, I do think there's something though about the fact that it's like all of the communist, you could still tell a story, right, about a communist nation fighting.
Are you trying to get to the point that the Morlocks are in the service of Satan and they must rebel against everything good and true and pure? That they're always in the posture of rebellion because they don't like the authority telling them good from bad. They don't like anything besides themselves being God. They don't like anything besides themselves being the rules of logic or the rules of good sense or the rules of common sense. They want to be able to make reality what they wish. And they get that from Nietzsche, by the way. That's a philosophical poison that entered the West in those days, and it's spread through the intelligentsia. And it's no one who actually has to work for a living. It's people like me. It's people who push around letters for a living who believe this kind of garbage. It's not people who have to cut down a tree or dig a ditch who believe that you can just make reality what you will of it. But the reason why they're always in the posture of rebellion is because they're the children of the ultimate rebel. They're all anarchists, deep down in their heart. Even though they talk like totalitarians, but keep in mind, totalitarianism is not anarchy. Totalitarianism is a type of anarchy. It's anarchy among the rulers. When the rulers have no rules to restrict what they can and cannot do, that's totalitarianism. It's not anarchy among the ruled. The ruled are reduced to slavery or worse. So totalitarianism is a type of anarchy. It's not a type of lawfulness. Lawfulness is what you had in the Middle Ages when everything was imbalanced against each other, or what you had in the American Constitution, where everything is very carefully set up with checks and balances to make it so that no one is outside the law and no one can operate without an authorization.
Yeah, actually, while that is a good point, it actually wasn't the one I was getting at because although I've got a nice way of describing it, because if you ever seen a Catholic baptism?
Yes.
Okay, there's the in the part where there are the vows, one of them is, "Do you reject Satan and all his works and all his empty promises?"
You're younger than I am. It's all his pomps and glamours.
Mm, okay,
Same word, but I'm used to the older wording in the right.
okay. In so the wording I'm familiar with there, which um, I especially like and is particularly relevant here, because you're talking about all his works, and I was actually thinking about and all his empty promises. That the
Well,
revolution,
yeah,
the revolutionary literature is always promising something that it never describes. That it's
it's no
always
pie today and no pie. It's always pie tomorrow and never pie today,
right,
right?
and so and there's a similar thing I think in that one
And
will
if I
find.
may, it's always, if I may, it's always peace tomorrow, but never peace today. Today we have to kill everyone in the Ukraine, and the New York Times has to lie about it, and we have to give a Pulitzer Prize to the liar. Okay,
Yeah,
but in the future, when everything is perfect, then we can stop killing people. Stalin will no longer have to butcher thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people. Sure. And they say
yeah.
we are have faith and we're superstitious. Okay.
Yeah. It's something I love to joke that faith in human beings is the stupidest faith possible to have. Um,
Yeah. Put no
I'm
faith in
always amazed by
Christmas.
the
Put no
people who
faith
say
in
that they're
Christmas.
losing their faith in humanity. You fool! You should never have had any faith in humanity. Trivial amounts of experience of human beings should show you that much. Um, but
that's
but
why I like
also,
that's why I like the cynicism of the founding fathers who wrote the American Constitution. Men, for all their empty promises, are going to be motivated by greed, pride, and self-interest. Okay.
yeah, but in bringing it back to the beginning, which hopefully I can pull this off and it'll be a good place to wrap up. In the story, in Heinlein's story, that there is the promise that all this will work out. That if you that there are these societies that work real well. We won't show you them. We won't show you what society looks like when you go and just sleep with people in a random house that you never met before and will never meet again. We'll never show what that looks like, but trust me, it'll be good. It'll be very good.
That's why when I was reading it and I used my imagination, I said, suppose Oscar Gordon gets one of the women pregnant, because that was the none of those girls were using the pill because they were trying to get the bloodline of heroes into their bloodline. That was the expressed point of it. It was eugenics. So suppose that girl has a daughter, and then she's raised in that society, and then the next hero who comes across is the hero from uh, let's say a Star Trek episode where he's got a face of a pig and he smells like lemons, and she's got to sleep with him, and and then the next day another hero comes through and she's got to sleep with him also. Now, that person is, even if the people on that planet are not human, if they're interfertile with human, that girl is going to be at least 50% Oscar Gordon's genes. Can you imagine any father in the world saying, yes, that's the life I would like for my daughter as an unpaid harlot in a way station on a foreign planet, acting as a eugenics sow for developing heroic races? I mean, are you out of your mind? But Heinlein, very carefully, because he's a good writer, doesn't bring that question up. It's just a done deal. He sleeps with the girl. The next day, he and Star and Rufo are off traveling a Fala, singing a song and going off to the next merry adventure, which happens to involve dinosaurs, which is way cool. So
But
that's the
it's
way you do it. The way you do it is you don't you make sure not to have. You see,
you don't
if
tell
the
two
reader
stories.
asks questions and you're a socialist, you're already hanged. Your narrative is blown up if the guy says, "What do you do with the people who don't want to share? What do you do with the? Where does it come? Who builds the stuff that you're using, that you're sharing? Where does the money come from?" And if they say, "Well, the government just produces the money," then all you have to do is say, "Well, why not just have the magic money fairy just solve all problems anyway without the government?" What do you think? If you're gonna say it's magic money fairy, if you're just gonna say in the future, in the post-human future, and so everything is free. And I, of course, go, okay, let's assume everything is free. One guy on the planet wants to use the free goods of the super futuristic future to reorganize the internal workings of the sun. Okay, which is a character in one of my books. You can't have two people do that. Okay, and no matter how rich you are, there's going to be something you want to do that's very expensive that not everyone can afford to do. So you're always going to have rich and poor people in any society, no matter how utopian it is. Because there's going to be the guy who sits on his duff or does something that's not as well rewarded, like me writing my books. Then you're going to have people who do things that are very well rewarded, like a girl who writes a Twilight book. Okay? And they have produced more good for society than I have, so they get more dough. Even if we lived in a society where everything else was free, books are not going to be free in that society. There's no such thing as a post scarcity world. There's no such thing as a utopia. It can't work outside of heaven. It can't work while we're still in this world that has entropy. It can't work if we're still in a world that has limitations.
Yeah. So what would you think of this summary? That in a book that's selling you snake oil, the book will never finish its story. And the way to distinguish it between a book that is not selling you snake oil, but simply has to end at some point, is that you could imagine in the book, in the good book that's not selling you snake oil, that simply has to finish at some point, you can imagine the story some way the story can continue in continuity with the story, in rational continuity with the story that is good, as opposed to the snake oil book where you cannot possibly finish that story in a good way, keeping in continuity.
I'm a little reluctant to agree because I can think of examples of stories that if you peered at them too closely, like let's say the story where a reporter is in a building that's being hit with a death ray, and he goes and puts on a circus strongman's performer's costume and a cape. He punches the death ray and goes and rescues the girl, and then he throws the mad scientist into a jail cell like this, and the door closes by itself, clang, and the guy's caught. That doesn't actually make any sense. If you examined it from the bad guy's point of view, he would go, oh, wait a minute, didn't I get my Miranda rights read to me? I'm going to assume that Superman read his Miranda rights. He's not a police officer. He's not a private citizen. He's not even from this planet. Okay? If you examine it too closely, it just doesn't make sense, but it's still, that story touches something in the human heart, which is a love of justice. You want to rescue the girl and you want to trash the bad guy. Okay? Especially those egghead bad guys who are always inventing stuff. So, and writers are tricky, sneaky little creatures because we put things in stories that we don't believe. I wrote an entire book called Null A Continuum, which was the authorized sequel to The World of Null A and Players of Null A by E. Van Vogt, which was my favorite story favorite story by my favorite author, and the gracious widow Lydia Van Vogt gave me permission to write the book. There is not a single thing in that book that I challenge anyone who knows me to see if there's anything in that book that comes from me as opposed to comes from Van Vogt. Because I'm a big Van Vogt fan, I've read all his other books, so I could put themes and stories and ideas in the book the way he would have done them. See, I don't think you can see my fingerprints. I think I've been a cunning little thief, and that you can't tell, where anything that's mine in there. It's all supposed to look like him. I'm a forger. Okay, so if you read that book and you tried to come to some conclusion about what I really believe about any of those things, I hope I fooled you because I'm trying really hard. I'm being very cunning and subtle. I've written a Jack Vance story. Now, in that one, of course, I actually am not as cynical as good old Jack Vance, so I actually had a happier ending than he would have put on it. And there's even one critic who caught me on that and then wagged his finger at me and said, "Wait a minute, this isn't a properly Jack Vance story because there's some hope and happiness at the end." And I went, "Okay, yeah, you got me, yeah." But I did his voice perfectly. I did his. I think I can do his way of speaking in a way that's non-cupatory. That's a little Jack Vance joke. In any case, if you use a rule of thumb, but you keep in mind it's only a rule of thumb and it's not a scientific rule, then I think saying, is it false to facts? Could you actually live in this world? what would a real person do in this world? Here's what killed me for Heinlein. I had a different rule of thumb. I said, what would Frodo do, or what would the Grey Lensman do, or what would Conan the Barbarian do? What would a heroic person do? Frodo would not sleep with the elf girl because they said, "Here in the Golden Forest, it is our custom that you sleep with a whore." Frodo wouldn't do that. Okay, he's too decent. The Gray Lensman is a pure Boy Scout, and he's awesome, and he kicks major butt, and he would not do it. Conan would be willing to sleep around, but if someone told him he had to, he'd punch the guy or run him through and say, by Crom, you dare? No, he's not a good hero, but there's something heroic about him. Jack Sparrow would sleep with the whore, and he'd go, yeah, that's great, So, but Jack Sparrow's not really the hero of the story. The blacksmith is supposed to be the hero of that story, but he's not as memorable as like Fu Manchu. No one remembers Nayland Smith. No one remembers the hero of a certain stories where the bad guy is just really, really amusing and really impressive. So that's my other rule of thumb. If you can imagine either yourself or a heroic person, or I can imagine Galahad or Gawain. Excuse me, I can imagine Gawain being tempted, Gawain and the Green Knight, but I can't imagine Galahad getting into that. Yeah, here's the Holy Grail. There's the love of Christ. I'll sleep with the whore without the benefit of marriage because it's your custom. And you are barbarians, and I'm a civilized Christian man, and my mission in life is to bring the law of King Arthur to these barbaric backwoods, and so I'm going to go by your customs rather than frickin' laws of England? Are you kidding me? If you go down in the book Glory Road, there's a scene where Oscar Gordon is daydreaming about what he wants to be in life, and there's a huge list that is a beautiful, stirring, and memorable passage of everything that he's ever read or seen from epics or literature or old poems or fairy tales that he wants to be. Someone says, "What do you want in life?" And he goes, "I want the Aladdin's lamp. I want to see the phoenix die and rise again. I want to I want to ride in a chariot with so the dust of my wheels are and so on and so forth." It's great. If you take any of the heroes from the people from the stories he's referring to in that passage and you put him in the same situation, you get a false value. Okay. So the next time you're reading about some utopia where there's if you're watching a cartoon show and half the warriors are women and you don't see the male warriors get in the way to try to protect the women because that's what men do instinctively, then you're watching propaganda because that's not what Frodo and the Grey Lensman and Lancelot and whatever, that's not the way they would act in that situation. The Amazons are make-believe. They're mythical. There's mythical centaurs. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think there are places in the world where they have so many enemies that they need to put their women in uniform. But even those places have found out that you got to segregate them by company. Otherwise, the men will naturally try to protect the women, and the baddies will target the women, try to shoot them and put them down, so that the men have to go, drag them off the battlefield, and so on. So,
yeah,
maybe the example of women in combat is too politically radioactive for me to use as an example. But the example of the woman who doesn't mind if you sleep around, or the example of the society where everything is free, or the example of the society where they don't have any need for money anymore because they all just work for their personal enlightenment, like they do in Star Trek Next Generation, from the Captain Marx Picard. Okay.
Or again, the society with no religion of any kind, like in Star Trek.
No religion, but which respects all other religions, but just not ours. Well, I mean, come on. I mean, just looking down the list, if Vol is a false god and Landru is a false god, and half the false gods you meet in the galaxy are just computers doing things, and then Spock shoots God in the fifth movie. I mean, even I would be really cynical about the line after that point, But the point being, if you can't swap in other heroes in that situation and still have them act heroic, then there's something going on. If you can't swap in a realistic merchant or a realistic economic exchange in that situation, then there's something going on. I mean, if you can't imagine opening a hot dog stand in that world, because because the perfect utopia will do something to stop you, or because no one drinks lemonade anymore in the lemonade stand. There's something wrong. The guy's up to something.
Mm.
The guy's up to something. Now, the problem is, reading a book is like auto hypnosis. You're supposed to fall into a dream. You're supposed to be enamored, allured. It's magic. The thing's supposed to come alive in your imagination. Okay. To analyze what you're reading, that is like analyzing a girl you're kissing. She won't like it, and you won't like it. Okay. You can fret about it later if you're a neurotic, but at the time when you're doing it, you just do it. Okay. You have to commit to the bit. You have to fall into the rapture. So it's not, even my rule of thumb is not a good rule of thumb, because I don't want anyone to read books and be on their guard. That's against the whole point. What you should be on your guard against, though, is there's a guy called Diversity in Comics. I don't know his real name. He refers to himself as My Boy Zach. He does have a real name, but I don't know what it is. He has made up a phrase that I want to copy called no escapism. The doctrine of no escapism is there's no place you can go, not in a comic book, not in a children's story, not in a nursery story, not in a fairy tale, not in a science fiction story, not in a space opera, not in a fantasy story, to escape from their politics. Everything has to be about their politics. Everything has to be about what they're talking about. So any story you read has to be about the white man is oppressing the gay black man. It's always got to be about oppression. It's always got to be about something topical. So let me recommend a completely different rule of thumb. If you can read that book 100 years from now or 100 years ago and it's still a good book, then it's probably not a snake oil salesman, because they only write about what's going on right now.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. That's an interesting one. The by the way, one
Glory, because the Heinlein story I read, if that had been printed in the Victorian era, no one would have bought that for a minute, because there was no sexual revolution going on.
Yeah.
Victorians were bold people. If you went up to them and said, "Your cultural values are incorrect," they would look at you and go, "We are sending missionaries to Borneo where they eat people, and we're teaching them Christianity. Are you frickin' kidding me?" Except they wouldn't say frickin' because their manners are better than mine. Okay.
Yeah. That is true. But there's a curious thing that you alluded to about Jack Sparrow, because at least I've never heard of novels in which he features. I only know the movies. An interesting thing I noticed, actually, especially in the Thin Man movies, contrasting the book Thin Man with the movie, and something. It's a special big problem with motion pictures, which is drunk people are always played by sober people.
Yep.
So there's a particular falseness that always goes on with drunk characters. The book The Thin Man read completely differently than the movie The Thin Man played, because Powell, I forget his name, was of course.
Powell's right. It's I don't remember his first name, but you're right.
But he was completely sober when he played him, and so the drinking had a completely different tone than the actual drunk in the story. So
that's because all art is exaggeration. I mean, people who are kissing each other on the screen don't actually have any romantic chemistry with each other, but they have to artificially enhance it so it comes through the camera and hits you in the eye.
Yeah.
And if I'm describing a fight scene, a real fight scene is nothing like a fight scene description. I have to try to get you to feel like you're in the fight. But if you were actually in the fight, it would just be a blur and someone hit you in the face. Okay. But in real fights, you have to show some sense of maneuvering and some sense of space and some sense of the danger and some sense of the speed in order to get it to be visceral.
Mm.
If I described it accurately, well, I mean, it's like reading a newspaper. Newspapers are not dramatic because they're too realistic.
No, that's true. The thing about drunks here is that there are a lot of the information comes through visually. We read human beings very well physically, just by seeing them and so on. And there's a tremendous amount of falsity of things that are really very important. Because the thing is, drunks are. I mean, for one thing, drunks are generally. Someone who is genuinely drunk is not witty. Somebody who is genuinely drunk is. They don't stand particularly well. There are a lot of things of that nature where the entirely sober actor is able to deliver his lines crisply and clearly. And the writer who was sober when he was writing the lines was able to think of witty things to say rather than apologizing for the 317th time for something of no great consequence in the drunk character. And there's an essential falsity to the drunk character as portrayed by the sober actor.
Yeah.
That's different than the falsity in writing a fight scene. And fight scenes, I mean, of course there's the falsity to them, but you still have the essentials in a fight scene in which the character is actually in danger. He may in fact be hurt. There are very few fight scenes in which you could describe Superman with some thugs who where he just kind of stands there casually as the bullets bounce off of him.
Yeah.
But that's a comedy scene, not a fight scene. There's still an essential danger in any sort of real fight scene, which is the important and most intrinsically important part of the fight scene. Whereas the thing about being drunk, though it does give you a certain amount of license to say things you wouldn't otherwise.
Why are we talking about being drunk? Or are you going to draw an analogy between drunkenness and falsehood in a minute?
No, it was actually to the use of Jack Sparrow and what Jack Sparrow would do. And Jack Sparrow wasn't really the hero, even though we think of Jack Sparrow, not the blacksmith. And I would contend that's actually a special case in which the acting talents of the sober man who played him come through, and the wit and charm and so on massively overpowered the much less interesting character of the blacksmith.
Well, the blacksmith wasn't getting much to do, also, unfortunately.
And
he didn't have any quirk. He didn't have any special. I could have written it better. Sorry, I don't mean to brag, but it was a good movie. Don't get me wrong. With that character, I could have done something with him.
Yeah, but not much was given for him, and he had the sort of character where he
consider that there's a book by Edgar Rice Burroughs called Pirate Blood, where a guy finds out that he's the descendant of Jean Lafitte, the pirate, and he starts to realize that he has impulses he can't control that are menacing and violent. Okay, well, Bootstrap Bill Turner was the guy's father. He was actually the son of a pirate. You could have done something with that. See, to give him a little bit of personality, give him a little bit of anyway, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, there are a lot of things one can do. I contend that one's a sort of special case because there's a sort of complex falsity,
it's not the same as the Fu Manchu case, where everyone remembers Fu Manchu and no one remembers the name of the English detective who's tracking him down, Nayland Smith. Because Nayland Smith doesn't have anything odd or interesting about him, whereas Fu Manchu has a exacting and precise sense of honor, a diabolical genius, and an oriental cruelty to him that is just great. And I'm sorry, there's people who think that that's a racist portrayal and that's negative. I can't imagine anything more flattering to some race that you're not familiar with than to say, these people are smart. And if you frill with them, they're dangerous. And if you... Okay, so whatever. Whatever, dude.
Yeah.
But here's what I want to say about the essential truth and essential falsity of what's going on. If you're talking about drunkenness, and I have to say that as a writer, my entire life is spent in falsehood, because here's the way it worked. In the garden, let me tell you a story, because once upon a time, when God gave man the gift of speech, the devil approached man and said, you can abuse this gift of speech to be greater than God by telling lies, which is something he can't do. And of course, Satan won a great victory on that day because he thought he had done something really clever with the gift of speech, which no animal lies, but then again, no animal talks. I don't count minor birds and cockatoos. That's not fair. They're not. And then the angels came to man and said, I understand you have the gift of lying. And he said, maybe, no. And they said, you can use that to tell stories because they're not true, but then you'll be serving heaven because you can then capture things in your falsehoods that are so subtle that just saying it literally, you can now do magic with the gift that the devil gave you, but we can turn it into something heavenly. So why don't you tell a fiction story? Why don't you write a poem? Why don't you sing a hymn? Why don't you sing a song? See, now, if the writer approaches the devil again and says, I have this great storytelling ability, I'm very persuasive, I can cast a glamour on people, they love hearing about my characters, they love hearing about my stories, Can I use this to gain power over them so they will change society for my political goals? The devil will say, yes, you're working for me again now. So that's how you tell the difference, if you can, if any human man can, between stories where the guy is serving the muse and serving truth as he can from the bottom of his heart, or even if he's, let's not mention the heart. Let's just say if he's putting out a workmanlike product where it's a good, solid story with a good, satisfying ending, memorable characters, and you haven't wasted your hard-earned beer money, okay? Because I'm competing for beer. I'm saying that my book is more entertaining than the thing you could have done with that $5 or that $20, okay? And if I'm serving the muse and I'm your servant and I'm trying to entertain you, that's different from me being trying to use the muse as a harlot, trying to adulterate what she does and merely make it the worm on a hook, and the hook is my politics, and I want you to believe my politics, and I want you to get you on my side, and I want you to start to hate people that I hate. Well, I'm working for the devil at that point. Now, the devil disguises himself as an angel. So if there's a rule of thumb to tell the difference between cunning lies in a medium that is automatically not literal, it's fiction automatically, you're smarter than I am. Your rule of thumb might be a good rule. My rule of thumb might be a good rule, but writers can be really subtle, and some writers are smarter than I am. Gene Wolfe is one of them. Tolkien is one of them. He's got a better muse than I've got.
Yeah.
So
Although I do think it's worth. I agree with what you just said. The one small thing I'd like to add to, I think, is that it's worth distinguishing between superficial falsehood and essential truth versus superficial falsehood and essential falsehood. That not that it's a way of telling the difference, but it is the essence between, what you described of, using, you tell a story that didn't happen in order to illustrate something that is genuinely true.
Yeah.
And that's having the essential truth, but a superficial falsehood.
Right. But it still serves truth. It's a falsehood that serves truth. So
yes, exactly.
The same way the devil tries to get words which are supposed to be for truth serve falsehood when you tell a lie. What's funny is there's a story called The Everlasting Story where the imagination land is actually being destroyed when people use stories to serve falsehood. All the characters, all the imaginary characters who are real in this book get destroyed when people, you abuse the artistic ability to tell convincing lies. So it's a perversion. The basic way. The problem is, here's another rule of thumb. Do you think your grandma, or in the case of this generation, your great grandma, would like and appreciate the story you're reading? You go to her and you say, "Hey, grandma, here's the part where Oscar Gordon sleeps with a whore, and he makes fun of people like you and says you're stupid." Okay, that's another good rule of thumb, because grandma, especially great grandma, she's been around the block and she lived through the Depression. At least if it's my grandma, she did. And if it's your great grandma, she might have lived through World War I, and actually, great grandpa might have seen people dying in the trenches, and they have some experience, okay. And the guys that people poo-poo nowadays, who lived in the ancient world, who lived in the Middle Ages, who lived in the Reformation, and who lived during the Napoleonic War, and who lived during the French Revolution, maybe they have something on the ball. Maybe they understand something you don't understand. So ask yourself, as a rule of thumb, does this book conform with the standard morality that every schoolboy knows or should know, provided he was homeschooled, about the basics of how human beings are actually supposed to act? Because the basics are the same, West or East, modern or ancient. There's a delightful book called The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, if you like reading essays. But he wrote the same book as a fiction book called That Hideous Strength. So if you like fiction, you can get the same message through pictures and images rather than through literal terminology. And in the appendix to the first book, he has just a list, more or less a random list, of things said by Norse witches and Christian theologians, pagan philosophers, and Oriental sages, and they all agree on the basics. Okay, they all agree. Adultery is bad, and benevolence is good, and murder is bad, and being kind to the poor is good, and so on and so forth. Every time someone's trying to pull the wool over your eyes, what they do is they take a lesser good, like compassion for the poor, and they say it excuses, because the ends justify the means, the greater good, like being honest and keeping your hands to yourself and not stealing other people's stuff and not killing 100 million people. Okay, that's what communism is. It takes a lesser good, benevolence to the poor, and it says it elevates it to the point of saying this justifies random worldwide violence against the capitalist class. Okay, the Oscar Gordon scene. It takes a lesser good, courtesy toward your host, and elevates it to a greater good. This is more important than chastity and marriage. Common sense, proper hygiene, and good male-female relationships.
Fatherhood.
Okay. And fatherhood. Okay. And that's the devil's only trick, is you look at something that's a lesser good, like an apple on a tree, and he says that is the greater good. Put that above as a higher priority than the man who made the tree, or in this case, the God who made the tree. See? So if you're on the lookout for that, where someone takes something that we all agree is a good thing, helping the poor is a good thing, sleeping with pretty women is a good thing, being polite to your host is a good thing, and so on, all good things. And look at what and now they're trying to elevate that above a greater good thing. Is the pretty woman your wife that you've vowed eternal fidelity to and given her your entire soul, body, and soul in life, and she's done the same to you, and you don't deserve it? Okay, that is much more erotic than the stupid horse scene that fooled me when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid, I wasn't a dad. I wasn't married. I hadn't even kissed a girl when I read that book. I didn't know. I knew more about Martians than I knew about girls. He was lying to a child. Okay, so there's my two rules of thumb. Ask your grandma, or if your grandma is too hip, ask your great grandma, or read a book from someone who is older than someone who's been dead 100 years. Okay, read something from someone who knows something about something. And I don't mean Nietzsche. Okay, he knows nothing and he died in a madhouse. Read a book about someone who doesn't contradict himself by saying it's good to go beyond good and evil. Wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Nietzsche. Can you say that again, please? Look at it, compare it to what everyone else on the planet has believed for all of time, and if it's a new technology or a new theory like faster than light drive or Einstein's relativity or Newtonian mechanics, then maybe the fact that no one else has thought of it before is a plus, is a positive. But if it's a new moral code, if I may quote C.S. Lewis, you can't think of a new moral code any more than you can imagine a new primary color in your head. It doesn't make any sense. So there's how's that for my final answer for what's a good rule of thumb? You can't really have a rule of thumb. It's a question of wisdom, and wisdom comes from experience. You can't really have a good rule of thumb that's going to work in all cases, because writers are subtle, and we lie for a living, and we know how to do it. I mean, I actually know how to set up a situation and a scene to glamorize something I don't believe in, or to glamorize something I do believe in. I know what the tricks are to do that. Okay? I mean, one of them is you make the bad guy and put in his mouth whatever it was that you want. You make him an ugly old, pushy, busybody woman who's naggy, and you have her say, well, you should get married first, when she's a divorcee, and make her a hypocrite. Okay?
Yeah.
I know how to build a straw man to knock down.
Yeah.
Writers are sneaky. But, so sometimes you're not going to be able to tell. But, I don't know, give it some time, reread it again 40 years later.
Yeah, no, that's actually, it's fun. I think C.S. Lewis actually did recommend a rule. For every modern book you read one book at least 100 years old. It's a rule kind of like that.
That's a good rule.
Yeah,
The problem is
it
I'm a
is.
science fan, and there's no science fiction over 100 years old, except for the stuff that was written by H.G. Wells, who's a socialist, who's a commie, and Jules Verne, yay, Roman Catholic. So,
yeah. Well,
and his engineering is good, but now it's dated. And I was just telling someone, I wish that whenever someone complains that a science fiction story is dated, I can say, well, if that's a curse, then have the evil fairy come by me and give me that curse. I would love to be remembered long enough in the future that my books are dated. That would be it, man. I would consider that a victory. I would take a second lap just for that one.
Yes, indeed. Well,
but
actually,
honestly, H.G. Wells' books are still more readable than Jules Verne's. Now that the submarine is fact and not fiction, but the Time Machine is still fantasy. It's still, still readable because he was talking about human nature. He was talking about the British social divide and about how you judge. Well, never mind what it was about. It's a good book, Time Machine. It's a short read. Go ahead and read it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the one other thing too, for children is one of the great problems of the modern era is they divide between youngsters and older people that really needs to be bridged. But one of the things too is younger people should make older friends and get their opinions on things because even if you don't agree with them, it broadens one's mind tremendously to get different perspectives and at least consider things from them.
Notice in the old days when people went to school, they were not segregated by age. That was a modern thing that John Dewey, another socialist, did on purpose to help the people become something that was more easily controlled. Because John Dewey was, in fact, rather deliberately trying to set up an education system to help with the socialist utopia to come. If it wasn't for educating people, when I went to school, the most difficulty I had reading books came from my English class, by which I mean if they had set up the program to discourage me from reading, they could not have done better than the books they assigned and the methods they tried to teach me to read. Because all the books were negative. All the books were this claptrap stuff, you know. All the books were there was nothing heroic, there was nothing good, there was nothing fun, there was nothing that stimulated my imagination.
Did you have to read The Catcher in the Rye?
It was assigned to me, but I was not necessarily the best student in school especially when I got my dander up. So I'm glad you mentioned The Catcher in the Rye, though. I haven't read the book, so I can make no comment about it. But there are other books that I
I really hated it. Actually, there's
deservedly so, probably. It's one of these modern nihilist books. I haven't read it, so I'm just guessing. Modern nihilism, right? It's preaching nihilism. It's preaching that there's no point in life. Right?
Yeah. Well,
how did I know that? Even though I never read the book, huh?
It's not quite preaching so much as
Well, it's
moaning about.
It's like it's got to have it as a sucker punch. It's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be obvious.
Actually, no, it's not that well.
We better call
it's
it
pretty
quits
obvious.
because you're cutting out on me again. I'm losing your signal.
Sorry. It's not actually. It's not.
Now I've lost you entirely. I'm sorry. I've gone deaf.
Oh wow. It seems to be working on this side. Are you picking up again?
I can say thank you in sign language.
Can you see me?
I can hear about every other word.
Ah. All right. So if I speak very slowly.
It's late, so well, that I heard.
Okay. Well.
But now what was the question again?
This is a good time then to say good night.
Good time.
God bless.
Live long and prosper. Because I'm such a horrible geek. Good night.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.